All right, and welcome back to another episode of Eviction Notice. This is episode 66. Today is August 30th, and I'm here with a very special guest, William von Wagenen. Or Wagenen? Is it Wagenen or Wag? I think it's Wagenen, correct? I think
Yeah,
that's
Vagenen. Yeah, exactly.
Wagenen. Thank you. Okay. So he is the author of Creative Chaos, How the CIA Started Its Dirty War on Syria, or is it Dirty War on Syria or Covert War on Syria?
Yeah, covert war to topple the Syrian government.
Syrian government. Thank you. But it was absolutely fantastic book, and I believe you've been. When did you get started in Middle Eastern politics?
Well, a long time ago. I'm almost 50 now. So my first interaction, or kind of introduction to the Middle East was I studied Arabic for a semester at Birzeit University in the West Bank. And that was back in the spring of 2003. So the second Intifada was still going on, and then that was when the U.S. invaded Iraq, of course. And I think a lot of people, this happens to them once they go to Palestine and see the terrible shit the Israelis are doing. It really kind of take over your life in a way. It's hard to kind of forget it, and then all the stuff in Iraq happened, and things just kind of snowballed from there. But that was my first thing, was going to Palestine and seeing the evils of the Israeli occupation, and of course the U.S. support for that.
Interesting. So when did you start studying the Syrian topic and the Syrian civil war and affairs that go on over there?
Well, that was a bit later, because after I was in Palestine, then I went to graduate school, and then, but I was watching the Iraq stuff really closely, and then in 2005, I went to Baghdad, to Iraq, and worked for a small, human rights NGO, and saw a lot of shocking things in Iraq and in Baghdad. That was during the height of the sectarian war in 2005. And then I went back to Iraq again for another stretch in late 2006, early 2007. So again, regarding Palestine and Iraq, I was watching things really closely. But Syria, once the conflict started in 2011 with the Arab Spring, I had never been to Syria. I didn't know that much about it. And so I kind of just assumed that the headlines I was reading were accurate. And I think a lot of people were tricked about the Arab Spring. It was a pretty sophisticated psyop. And so regarding Syria, like I was for a long time, or most of my life, I was an anarchist, like a libertarian socialist.
Oh, Chomsky type.
Yeah, Chomsky guy, big time. Not anymore, but that's another topic. I'm not a fan of Chomsky. In fact, I deeply hate him now. But when you saw like these reports, on CNN or Al Jazeera or BBC, that there are these protesters that want freedom and they're protesting against a dictator, it just kind of fit my worldview that, I go to protest, and I hate governments. So it just kind of fit my worldview that, of course, the protesters must be doing the right thing, and the government must be evil. But then, I just didn't have the background knowledge about Syria to know any better. But then over time, over the next couple of years, as I just continued to study, then I started seeing through the bullshit or through the propaganda, and I started to see that, these contradictions, which, we can get into if you want. But then I started writing about the Syria war over the years. I started writing some really lengthy papers about it for the Libertarian Institute, and then that's what finally turned into the book, which again just focuses on the U.S. and Israeli role, the CIA, State Department role in basically sparking the protests in Syria, and then also funding and arming these extremist groups, basically Al Qaeda or Islamic State fighters, that they helped flood into the country and fight against the Syrian government, kind of under the cover of the protests, you might say.
The moderate
Anyway, so I
rebels.
just realized it was basically a U.S. and Israeli operation
Mm.
disguised to look like a spontaneous grassroots protest movement that just kind of turned into an armed struggle. That's just not how it happened. But again, the propaganda was very sophisticated. So it took me a few years to kind of see through the nonsense.
I think that was a lot of people's reaction. I think another famous guy who supported the protests initially and then became one of the biggest critics of the supposed rebels and America and Israel's involvement. I think Max Blumenthal was someone who initially supported it, and then he became a big critic. It's a story of a lot of people, but a lot of people got caught up in the Arab Spring, and it wasn't until I looked into the situation that actually armed Islamicists have kind of always had a problem with the Syrian government, going all the way back to the early 80s that cultivated in the 1982 Hama massacre. So can you speak a little bit about that and the involvement of the Muslim Brotherhood going back decades in their struggle against the Syrian government?
Yeah, so a quick note on that regarding the Arab Spring, and then I'll talk about Syria. Again, it seemed like when the protests erupted in Tunisia, in Egypt, Libya, etc., Yemen, it seemed like they were these grassroots protests, but it turns out that in late 2010, like September 2010, the Obama administration held a series of meetings with the State Department, with the CIA, and also with some tech executives from Google, Facebook, and et cetera.
Cohen.
And they basically they issued a policy paper or a strategy paper. It's called the Presidential Study Directive 11. And it explicitly or very clearly calls for the U.S. to support regime change in all of these different Arab governments and to replace these kind of aging Arab authoritarian presidents and replace them with governments led by the Muslim Brotherhood with political Islamists. Mm-hmm. So that's really who was behind all these protests in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, etc. And then in a couple cases, specifically Libya and Syria, it was not only protests led by Islamists that they were organizing, it was also armed insurgencies with these Al-Qaeda affiliated fighters. So in Libya, that took the form of members of an Al-Qaeda group called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group that had their base in the UK, basically, and that had fought with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. They were all sent from the UK to Libya to fight. And then in the case of Syria, the U.S. government released large numbers of Islamic State leaders from the prison in Buqa in Basra, more like in 2010, and they sent a lot of the Islamic State fighters then to Syria. And then also they released a lot of Al-Qaeda linked fighters from Lebanon from a group called Fatah al-Islam. Mm-hmm. And they crossed the border from the Lebanese side, and they started this, Islamist or Salafist or Al-Qaeda-led insurgency against the Syrian government. So the thing, I guess, to remember is that the Muslim Brotherhood is a tool of the United States, Israel, and their allies to cause chaos and cause violence, in particular sectarian violence, in countries that are enemies of the United States and of Israel. And the Muslim Brotherhood has had a connection to the UK or to the UK intelligence going back, to its founding basically in the 40s and the 50s. And UK intelligence has manipulated the Muslim Brotherhood for decades for its own purposes. And again, so that the first time that the U.S. and Israel tried to do a regime change operation of the sort we saw in 2011 was, as you mentioned, in the late 1970s. There were some CIA documents that described the strategies to basically send Islamists across the border from Jordan into southern Syria and to establish like the Free Syrian Forces The language described in these CIA documents about what they wanted to do in the 70s, like totally matched what they ended up doing way later in 2011.
Right.
But in the late 1970s, basically the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, they started an assassination campaign against government officials from the Ba'ath Party. They tried to assassinate Hafiz al-Assad, who was the president and the father of Bashar al-Assad. And they started in 1980. Well, in 79 it really started, but it kind of culminated in this major insurrection in the town of Hama in Syria in 1982, where the Muslim Brotherhood, they were heavily armed, and they launched an insurrection in the town where they again went around assassinating and killing Syrian government officials. There was also, I think this was 1979, there was a famous massacre of Alawite cadets in the artillery school in Aleppo. That kind of kicked off this conflict, which again went for the next few years. And so Hafiz al-Assad, he famously, put down that uprising in Hama. And the Muslim Brotherhood, claims that Hafiz al-Assad killed maybe 20,000 people or more while crushing that uprising. There was a Defense Intelligence Agency document that said the number was close to around 2,000. But again, it was
That's a big difference. That's a big difference. 40,000 and 2,000.
Yeah, but again, there was this armed insurrection where the Muslim Brotherhood was getting weapons from the Israelis, from the Jordanians, and ultimately, indirectly from the U.S. in order to try to topple the Syrian government, because it was, Hafiz al-Assad was opposed to Israel. So again, the Muslim Brotherhood has always been this tool, and the tool they use is sectarianism, because the head of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, his name was Saeed Hawa. And in all of his writings, he was constantly citing the medieval Islamic scholar named Ibn Taymiyyah, who was issuing fatwas or religious edicts saying that the Shia and the Alawites and the Druze should all be killed and their property taken because they're heretics and things like this. So again, that's the playbook of the U.S. and Israel, is use these sectarian Islamists from the Muslim Brotherhood in order to create chaos in these states that are opposed to them, because the Israelis constantly, this is the case in Iraq as well, they constantly want to divide up any powerful Arab state that has a powerful army, that has, especially that has oil revenue like Iraq, and turn it into, divide it up into these sectarian mini states, Alawite that are killing each other, Alawis killing Sunnis, Sunnis killing Alawites, Shia killing Alawites, Shia killing Sunnis, Sunnis killing Shia, Arabs killing Kurds, Kurds killing Arabs. So in both Syria and Iraq, that's kind of been their game plan. So again, it does go back to like this happening in 79, 82, and then the U.S. and Israel, they just kind of rebooted the old playbook in 2011.
Right. It's interesting because, when people defend, they call it a revolution. It wasn't a revolution. It was an armed insurgency. And when they talk about how organic, they try to portray it as organic, and these were protests that were put down violently, and then that started the violence. And then you look into it, and it's like actually the CIA and Mossad had planned since the 70s and the 80s to overthrow the Syrian government using armed Islamicists. It kind of puts everything in perspective. So in the 1980s and 70s, you have an armed Islamic insurgency that's put down. You fast forward into the 1990s, and you get the clean break memo. And that also had plans for overthrowing the Syrian government, as well as Iraq and Iran. And you get the plan. I forget how many countries it was, but it was like, I think, overthrowing 7 countries in 5 years. And that also included Syria. So it had very much been a policy for decades and decades amongst what eventually became known as the neocons in America and Israel to overthrow the Syrian government. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, the U.S. and the Israelis have used, these Islamic groups, in Afghanistan in the 80s. which is well known, of course, the Mujahideen. But then the U.S. and the CIA, again, the Israelis and the British were often involved in this too, where they sent the Mujahideen, quote unquote, to fight in Bosnia
and Kosovo
and in Chechnya. So there's this long history of them using them. And in fact, in Iraq, the way that Al-Qaeda in Iraq got its start, everyone knows about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Jordanian who founded Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but people don't know that actually Al-Qaeda in Iraq was founded by Kurdish mujahideen who had fought for the CIA in Afghanistan. And then they returned to the Kurdistan Autonomous region, northern Iraq, in the 90s, and they actually fought for Masoud Barzani in the civil war, the Kurdish civil war in the 90s. And so these Kurdish mujahideen were under the control of Masoud Barzani, who was a close U.S. and Israeli ally. And then when the U.S. needed an excuse to invade Iraq in 2003, all they did was take Zarqawi and stick him in one of the Kurdish Mujahideen training camps in an area of Iraq that was under the control of the Kurds, that wasn't even under the control of Saddam. And then they said, "Oh, look, Saddam is supporting Al-Qaeda because there are these jihadists in Kurdistan." Anyway, so then those Kurdish Mujahideen, they really formed basically the early Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then Zarqawi was brought in to recruit Arabs to join the Kurds. But really, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a Kurdish operation with U.S. and Israeli backing, and the idea was to, again, in Iraq, to create a civil war. If you had these crazy sectarian Sunnis who would be doing suicide bombings against the Shia, and vowing to commit genocide against the Shia like Zarqawi did, then you get a sectarian civil war, and that allows Iraq to be divided up and the Kurds to get their independence and to make Iraq weak and no longer able to oppose Israel. So there's all these connections of how the U.S. and Israel, they use these groups, and then again it culminated in the Syria operation in 2011.
Right. And so you get what's interesting about the sectarian stuff, actually, just real quick, is I actually think most of that stuff is fake. It doesn't have much popular basis amongst the actual people in the region. You talked about Al-Qaeda. That Al-Qaeda being this super sectarian group that kills Shia and basically everyone that doesn't adhere to the strict Salafist, Wahhabist theology that they have. You look at I don't know if I'd call it the original Al-Qaeda or whatever, but when you look at Osama bin Laden really didn't have that kind of radical sectarianism where you hate the Shia and hate the Alawites. He was a product of a mixed marriage relationship. His mother was Shia. And so that didn't really start until you get to Iraq, when the United States became very clear. I think Seymour Hersh was who reported on it in 2007, the Great Redirection, where the Shia are now the enemies of the United States. So you have the overthrow, putting that aside, you have the overthrow of Iraq, and this was a huge blunder amongst the United States and Israel and the neocons, because Iraq was kind of used as the bulwark against Iran. Saddam Hussein was a bit, until 1991 with the invasion of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein was an American ally. He was and then you get the overthrow of Iraq, and that, it was interpreted as increasing Iran's influence in the region. And then, from my understanding, what happened is when operations really increased to go after Syria, this was because, they knocked Iran up a peg with the overthrow of Saddam. You got to knock them down too by overthrowing their ally in Syria. Do I have that correct, basically, or is that?
Basically, yeah. Although with the Iraq, I would give or with Iraq being an ally of the U.S. under Saddam, I've actually kind of learned recently that is not actually correct. So I've been reading a lot because I'm writing another book now about the Yazidi genocide in Iraq.
Yeah, so you had an article about that.
Committed by ISIS, and we talk about that. I'd like to talk about that maybe in a bit. But in looking back on or reading more about that history, it turns out that the U.S. was basically supporting initially kind of both sides during the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. but they actually did tilt towards the Iranian side. And in fact, the Israelis were strongly supporting the Iranians during that period. People, I'm sure, know about the Iran-Contra scandal,
Mm-hmm.
where the Israelis were selling weapons to the Iranians and they were getting Iranian oil in return. And the Israelis viewed the Iranians as an ally, including after the 1979 revolution with Khomeini, and they viewed Iraq as their biggest enemy. So the Israelis really were trying to help the Iranians in the war against Saddam. And when Saddam finally won the war after 8 bloody years, the Iraqis finally won in 1988, and immediately there was a campaign was started, led by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a guy named Peter Galbraith, who later participated in the destruction of Yugoslavia. He was the son of Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist. But Peter Galbraith, he was Jewish, probably a Mossad agent, to be honest, but he worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And as soon as Saddam won the war against Iran, immediately Galbraith and other people in the U.S. Senate, with Israeli encouragement, they started this campaign to falsely blame Saddam for chemical attacks against the Kurds. And then there was the whole idea of the Anfal campaign, where Saddam Hussein killed 200,000 Kurds and used chemical weapons against them and destroyed all these Kurdish villages. And it turns out that didn't really happen. That was just a big propaganda campaign on the part of the U.S. government, because they wanted to suddenly demonize Saddam and prepare the ground to invade Iraq, which finally happened not until 2003. But of course, they launched the war in 91. But all this propaganda to demonize Saddam and lay the groundwork for a future war started by making up this fake story about a genocide against the Kurds in the late. And that's something I learned, more recently. But otherwise, yeah, at any rate, by the time you had 9/11, in my opinion, the Israelis, with the help of the CIA and the Saudis, but it was mostly an Israeli operation. And the idea was that the Israelis wanted to bring the Americans onto their side to launch wars against all these different countries. And as you mentioned, there was a plan to invade 7 countries in 5 years that was revealed by Wesley Clark, who was the former NATO chief. And he said that, people he knew in the Pentagon revealed to him that, yeah, the neocons had a plan to take out 7 countries in 5 years. And that included Syria, and that included Iran by that point. Later, the Israelis tilted against Iran. It was more like in the mid-90s where they really became enemies.
It's when they started upping their support for Palestinians around in the 90s. Iran did.
So, but again, at the end of the day, Israel really played a key role in all this stuff, but there's just this long history of them using these Muslim Brotherhood-based sectarian groups. As you mentioned, Saddam Hussein, which again, in my opinion, Al-Qaeda was an operation from the beginning, right? But there was no sectarianism because they needed them, again, to fight like against the Soviets, so against the atheists, or then later in Bosnia, they needed them to fight against the Orthodox Christian Serbs. But in Syria in the 70s, they did need them to fight against the Alawites. And so they did activate these sectarian elements in Syria in the 70s. And then again in Iraq, that was important to use that sectarianism against the Shia. And then, of course, in 2011, to do it again against the Syrian government. So in the early protests, in Syria, if you're watching CNN, you would see more like liberal protesters who were talking about democracy and whatnot. But in many of the protests, probably the majority, I would say, you had very sectarian elements where they were, quoting Saudi clerics, Wahhabi clerics, and they were talking about ethnically cleansing Christians. They were talking about exterminating Alawites.
Alawites to the grave. Christians was a very big very big chant. Alawites to the grave, Christians to Beirut was something they were always chanting.
Yeah, and so in on the ground in Syria, people were hearing those type of chants, and they were like, okay, well, I've got some problems. I don't really maybe like the Syrian government or Bashar al-Assad too much, but I don't like these type of chants. And so,
Mm-hmm.
um, again, it's no surprise that the war kind of devolved into what it devolved into. But again, that was a lot of the propaganda. Like the propaganda said that there were these grassroots protests, and then Assad's security forces came and just would open fire and kill protesters. And then these protesters had no choice but to pick up arms. And then members of the army were so disgusted by it and refused to open fire on the protesters, so they would defect. And then they started this Free Syrian Army. And then only later did the Islamists and Al Qaeda come in and hijack, this otherwise secular democratic revolution. That was the narrative you get from CNN. But again, the more I researched it, I realized no, actually, again, the United States, number one, trained these activists who were organizing the protests, like on Facebook, for example. And then
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, the U.S. And these other intelligence agencies were flooding Syria with militants from the Islamic State in Iraq, and then from this group Fatah al-Islam in Lebanon. And these militants were entering the protests, and they would actually open fire often on Syrian security forces and on protesters, even like in a false
Mm-hmm.
flag type of a way. And so what the Syrian government was dealing with, CNN said they're just coming in and massacring protesters, but what the Syrian government and the security forces were actually dealing with was not only protests, but also this Al Qaeda-led insurgency at the same time that was all mixed in together.
Right.
And so that was a very difficult thing to manage. And with the sectarianism, sorry to ramble on, but
You're
go
good.
back to one of your other quotes, like you said, the sectarianism was driven by the actions of these intelligence agencies and the terrorist groups that they were actually supporting covertly. But the problem is that once that type of sectarian killing begins, and this maybe was more the case in Iraq than in Syria, but it was the case to some extent in Syria. Once the sectarian killing begins, initiated by these intelligence agencies, it does often take on a life of its own, and the hatred
Mm-hmm.
can get really intense. And so Iraq, was particularly brutal. And again, that was the time I was in Baghdad in 2005 when the sectarian war got really, really bad. And it really was Sunnis and Shia that really just hated each other and were killing each other at any opportunity they got because of what had been sparked by
Right.
suicide bombings by Al Qaeda that were orchestrated by the U.S.
Right. Well, to get into this, to the actual nitty gritty of the Syrian situation, the reason why I don't really buy a lot of the things or why I didn't buy a lot of the things the people who were supporting the CIA-sponsored revolution were saying is because, when you get into the sectarianism, but then you look at what Syria is. Syria was a majority Sunni country. The majority of the SAA was Sunni. You look into, when the rebels went to Idlib, and the vast majority of Idlib was Sunni, and the vast majority of Idlib did not support the rebels. And that was something that was acknowledged by the rebels. I think there was this quote by an FSA guy. It was like 70% of them aren't with us. And you look at where the protests really started at, it was in these communities where Salafism was very popular. And as you said, they were starting to smuggle, insurgents around 2010. There's reports of, people from Lebanon and Jordan crossing the border to come over. And as you said, when they shut down Camp Bucca in Iraq in 2009, and you say, a lot of these guys are Islamic State guys, and then you look into like the names of the people that were released, and it's literally the people leading it. It was al-Baghdadi, it was Jalani, and these guys were just let go. And this was at a time when ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Iraq was basically defeated. And then the prisons, they let the guys go, and then there's an immediate resurgence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then they go to Syria like as soon as the protests get going, and even sometimes before that. And they were the guys leading it.
Yeah, exactly. And so these groups are really useful, again, to the intelligence agencies, because you could pay an Al Qaeda member, $300-400 a month, and he'll go and kill a bunch of people for you. And if he gets killed, it's different than sending the U.S. Army over there
Right.
and having veterans on disability for the rest of their life and paying salaries to these guys, or paying private contractors like Blackwater, paying these guys $200,000 a year. You can literally pay a poor, Syrian or Iraqi guy a couple $100 a month and pump their brain full of sectarian propaganda, and literally have an army at your disposal to affect a regime change, and cause chaos in an enemy state. So it's a really effective way to do these terrible things that the U.S. and these other intelligence agencies are constantly doing. Um, but obviously, very, very, very tragic.
Hmm. So you mentioned there were a series of false flag events at the start of the protest. What roles did like snipers have? Like just these snipers that were on the roof shooting at security forces and whatnot. I feel like that was a very big element of the really the more violence in the start of the conflict starting. You had these snipers on the roof sniping at security forces, and a lot of the security forces weren't even armed besides with just shields and batons. They had to call in helicopters, hours after the violence had actually started.
Yeah, so these snipers played a big role, and the idea is that if you are trying to start a quote unquote revolution and you want to turn the population against their government, one way to do that is to kill some innocent people and turn them into martyrs, and then promote the idea that the government security forces killed them. Then there are people who used to be, or in the past were like, content with the government or with the government, and then they see, or they think that, the government just murdered these innocent protesters. Well, that's not good. I'm upset about that, and so they turn against the government. So it's a deliberate tactic, and the snipers are the best way to do that, because if there are snipers, say there's a protest and snipers suddenly start opening fire, no one knows really where the fire is coming from. And if
Right.
protesters are killed, the automatic assumption is like, oh, it must be the police that's doing it. And so again, that's just a way to create anger in the population against the government that they previously would be happy with or supportive of. And this tactic was used not only in Syria, but actually in all of the Arab Spring
Mm-hmm.
countries. So in Tunisia, the first place where the protest started, on the one hand, they were organized by these activists Tunisian activists who had been trained by the State Department in different workshops in places like Beirut or even in Washington, D.C. But on the other hand, the protests weren't really threatening to topple Ben Ali until a few weeks in a town called Kasserine, kind of out of the way place. There was all of a sudden these snipers started appearing, and over the course of a few days, they killed 30 or 40 people, just putting, bullets through the back of these protesters' heads. And no one really knew who these, where these snipers had come from. But of course, the assumption was, well, like, they must be from the government, I guess. And as soon as all these protesters started getting killed, President Obama suddenly came out and said, oh, you know what, Ben Ali, you're killing your own people. You've lost legitimacy, and now you need to go. And a couple of days later, the public opinion turned against Ben Ali, and he finally fled the country. So you could say, okay, well, who knows? How do we really know who these snipers are, et cetera? But then in Egypt, a couple weeks later, literally the exact same thing happened. And when there's protests at Tahrir Square, and there's protests against the Ministry of Interior building down the street from Tahrir Square in Cairo, suddenly there are snipers, blowing the brains out of these protesters. And what do you know? All of a sudden, Obama gets up on TV and says, "Hey, Mubarak, you've lost legitimacy. You need to go." And it's like, okay, well, that's 2 times. And then in Yemen, the exact same thing happens in Yemen. There were protests against Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president, but they never really took off until suddenly these snipers appeared and just started killing large numbers of people. And then same thing, Obama calls for him, to step down. And then in Libya, the same thing happened. Although again, in Libya, it was more like Syria, where there were literal Al Qaeda members who started a full-on insurgency like very, very quickly. Whereas that was not the case in Tunisia and Egypt and in Yemen. But this is a tactic. And then the clearest instance of this tactic, in fact, was a few years later in Ukraine.
Maidan.
In Maidan. And if you go to Ukraine now or to Kyiv and you go to Maidan Square, there's, at least when I went a couple of years ago, there's pictures of 100 people who were killed during these protests in early 2014, and they called them the Heavenly 100. And the idea was that there was this pro-Russian president, Yanukovych, and then there were these protests of people wanting, to oust him. And all of a sudden, allegedly, his security forces, the Berkut, came and, shot these 100 protesters. And that made everyone so angry that they, pushed him out of power. But it's very, very clearly documented by a Canadian-Ukrainian academic named Ivan Kachenovsky, I think. Where he did this, extremely in-depth investigation. There was so much social media and so much camera footage taken of that particular situation that you could definitively show that, in fact, the protesters or members, the people from the opposition or from the protesters, in particular from these far-right neo-Nazi groups, were the ones that were actually firing on the protesters and on the anti-riot police. So when you see the same thing happen like clockwork in Tunisia, and then a few weeks later in Egypt, and then in Yemen, and then in Libya, and then in Syria, and then in Ukraine, it's the exact same pattern. It's pretty obvious what's going on.
And in Ukraine, it was so much more obvious that was snipers, is because we have documented interviews of like right sector guys claiming that they were on the hotel sniping people, right? Because eventually then they would go to the Donbass and fight against Russian separatists and people who had sympathies with Russia there. So we just have direct evidence of those guys literally saying that they were on the hotel sniping at people. But to get a little bit back into Syria, how real was the FSA, right? You have the insurgency breaks out, violence breaks out, and eventually you have this, what was portrayed in the West as moderate rebels, and it was organized by defectors, and there's just this loose coalition of people operating under the Free Syrian Army. But how real really was that, and were the groups that made up the FSA, were these guys actually moderate rebels?
Well, if you take, again, that was the narrative, that they were all defectors and that they were had defected because they refused to open fire on peaceful protesters. But if you take a closer look at the different FSA groups that emerged in the different cities, in Damascus itself, in Homs, in Aleppo, then you see that, in fact, these groups were not defectors. And in fact, in Homs, for example, which is one of the earliest hotbeds of the insurgency, because these al-Qaeda-led fighters were coming across the border from Lebanon, which is close to Homs. The main FSA group there was called Kata'ib al-Faruq. And some of their commanders gave interviews to journalists saying, we're not defectors. And, they were getting their money from Salafist sheikhs in the Gulf, and it was a local Salafist sheikh or preacher who organized the group, and they had many fighters in their ranks who had gone to fight in Iraq with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And as we mentioned before, they're using phrases like Alawites to the grave and Christians to Beirut. And in fact, there, if someone from the Syrian army tried to defect, as was the claim,
They'd kill him.
They would just execute them most of the time, because they would say, well, you're, an apostate that fights for this apostate government, and they would just execute them. So even if soldiers had really wanted to defect, in most cases they would just be killed. So, and then in Aleppo, for example, the big FSA group there was called Liwa Tawhid, which was founded by a Salafist sheikh, and he actually, well, for example, that group, Liwa Tawhid, when they invaded Aleppo, that was the instance where they acknowledged that like 70% of the people from Aleppo were against them. And Aleppo is a Sunni majority city. They acknowledged that, hey, the people here in Aleppo don't like us. And most of them were from the countryside. And so when they entered the city, the Sunnis in the cities didn't like them. But they also immediately had members of Al-Qaeda embedded within them, within their group, from Jabhat al-Nusra, the official Al-Qaeda affiliate, which was the offshoot of the Islamic State in Iraq. And they were sharing a headquarters in the eye hospital in Aleppo. And so you had a Free Syrian Army group that actually has like an Islamic name, the Tawhid like brigade, and Tawhid is like basically means like monotheism. It's something that extremist Muslims would promote, like the oneness of God. Not only extremist Muslims, but any Muslim, of course, worships just one God. But this name is an indication that it was an Islamic group. But then again, in the West, they were portrayed as the Free Syrian Army, secular. And so they would get all these weapons from the Turks and the CIA and on and on and on. And these Free Syrian Army groups would just be fighting side by side with Al-Qaeda and with Jabhat al-Nusra. And so they would just be, the Free Syrian Army groups would get the weapons from the Western powers and their allies and just provide them to the Al-Qaeda groups, because they were fighting side by side. And in fact, they would often have agreements where, let's say they did a big operation or an offensive to take like a particular air base or to take over this city or this village. The Free Syrian Army media people would be the ones who would always take credit for the operation. They'd say, oh, okay, well, we just took over the city of Ras Al Ain, for example, in northern Syria. And they would announce to Al Jazeera, and CNN, that, hey, the Free Syrian Army just took over this city. We defeated the Syrian army. But then it was actually Jabhat al-Nusra that actually took over the city, but the Free Syrian Army would be allowed to just take credit for the operation, even though they were not the main group actually fighting on the ground. So they had this game going on, which again, to the outside world, it would just obscure really what was happening. And that even happened too with the oil fields in Deir East, where the Free Syrian Army announced, hey, we just took over Raqqa and we just took over these oil fields in Deir ez-Zor. And then, the more you research it, you realize that actually it was the Nusra Front, who Jabhat al-Nusra, who took over Raqqa, that took over these oil fields. But it's just the Free Syrian Army announcing that they had done it. So again, that's why it was hard to figure out what was going on in Syria, because there were so many groups and there was so much propaganda and there were so many things being obscured in the media, that unless you just really had this kind of autistic like focus on what was happening, it was just hard to see through it. So again, there were some people who saw through the bullshit much sooner than I did. One of the best people, of course, to follow on the Syrian war is Kevork Almasian, who is from Aleppo. If people know him, Syrian analysis. I would always encourage people to check out his stuff. He saw through it, from the beginning, basically, or within just the first few months. I guess a little bit easier for him, maybe, since he's Syrian and spoke Arabic, obviously, and was seeing these videos of the Free Syrian Army guys and the Nusra guys massacring people that just weren't seen by people in the West. How did you kind of come to that conclusion, by the way? Like, what was your...
Oh, I'm a little bit on the younger side, right? So when I started looking into the Syrian civil war, it wasn't when, even in the first couple years of the things, it was when Trump was in office, and it was when he decided he was going to bomb Syria. And I remember him saying during the primary that Obama and Hillary Clinton founded ISIS and that Russia is fighting the terrorists in Syria. And so he was just openly kind of saying these things, and then, which turned out to be true, but then he decided, even though he had said that, he was going to go back, own that, and bomb Syria because of another fake allegation of chemical weapons being used, I think around 2017. And so that's when it clicked in my mind that, like, oh yeah, they actually are terrorists. Like this is actually Al Qaeda and ISIS because, well, the president of the United States kind of alluded to that during the elections, and then he just went along with it and decided that he was going to support those guys anyway. And then I studied. I was looking into it during then, right, and then I got back into looking into the Syrian civil war during the December offensive, the 13-day offensive when Assad, when it ended and he fell. And I was paying really close attention to that because you're hearing the stories come out of the massacring of Alawites that took place as soon as Assad fell. Israel immediately expanded as soon as Assad fell. And I paid attention, right when that was happening, and then I kind of stopped paying attention to it after Jelani took power, and then I got back into it studying the Syrian situation once the Iran war took off. Because when the Iran war took off, you had so many of these influencers from the Arab world claiming to, defending the policy of the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia allying with America and Israel because, Iran is evil and hates the Sunnis because they allied with Bashar al-Assad and helped him commit a Sunni genocide in Syria. So I started re-looking back into it, very recently, and that's when I'd been familiar with your work at the Libertarian Institute, but I discovered that you had written a book, and I read the book recently, and it was just fantastic. So I had to have you on. But that was my kind of study of Syria. It had like 3 phases, and the first one started around 2017 when Trump decided he was going to go back on his policy and bomb Syria.
Okay. So yeah, now things have really come full circle because when I first started writing, I started writing a lot in 2015, 16. And back then, again, even it took me a few years to figure out what was going on. So I was a little bit late to the game. But even back then, if you would say things like Israel wants Bashar al-Assad overthrown, people would say you're crazy and you're a conspiracy theorist, and or that Israel was supporting, ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra. Not only Israel, but the U.S., of course. People would say, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. The CIA didn't do any of this. You're just denying that Syrians have any agency." What were some of the other arguments? They would say, well, the Israelis wanted Assad to stay in power because, look, the border with the Golan Heights was always quiet during Bashar al-Assad's reign, and he's the devil they know. And
yes, I remember that talking point.
These Syrian revolutionaries take over, they're going to fight against Israel and all this stuff. And, Assad secretly supports Israel. And then, in later years, the Israelis just came out and acknowledged that, hey, we were supporting Jabhat al-Nusra. And, when they were fighting in southern Syria, when they would get injured and, we'd let them cross the border and we'd treat them in Israeli hospitals. And there was a couple of instances where the Israeli Air Force literally bombed the Syrian army right when it was in the middle of battles with Jabhat al-Nusra. So that essentially became obvious, but then it became very obvious, even more obvious, after Bashar al-Assad fell, because as you mentioned earlier, immediately the Israelis, that gave them the opportunity to do this massive bombing campaign over the course of about maybe 2 weeks, where they just destroyed basically every Syrian military facility, all of their research, military research institutes, all their heavy weapons, all of their anti-aircraft, like missile defense batteries. And they just, basically made Syria defenseless. And then, they occupied a bunch of new territory. Since 1967, they've been occupying the Golan Heights, but immediately with Assad gone, they could just move in to take more Syrian territory, including Mount Hermon, which was, on the border, and it was very high, so it overlooks Damascus essentially. So now the Israelis control that high ground, which would allow them to just fire artillery into Damascus very easily and just, destroy Damascus even with artillery. And they've turned the entire southern Syria into a demilitarized zone where only they can go, and they're doing these daily raids into additional territory in Syria, and they're taking over the Yarmouk Valley in southern Syria that has a lot of water.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, was the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp, where because we were talking about how so many Syrian residents didn't like the rebels really, and a lot of them did not want the FSA to come and invade into their towns. Idlib is an example. Another example, and this was a huge embarrassment for the United States, was Raqqa, because that's where the Islamic State actually started and basically became the capital for ISIS. And you have during the Battle of Airplanes, you have the FSA commander saying that I have great relations with our brothers in ISIS, and they are great fighters and they're a part of the revolution. And but another example where the residents did not want the rebels to come in was the Palestinian refugee camps, not just Yarmouk, but basically all of them. And that's because the Palestinians wanted to stay neutral, because they had a history of when they got involved in these intra-Arab conflicts, they would not really get treated well by the states where these conflicts were happening in. I think one example is Kuwait. The Palestinians kind of gave vocal support to Saddam Hussein, and then they got expelled from Kuwait. So they wanted to stay neutral. And the FSA and the rebels, and the FSA, this was obviously Nusra that came in, dominated it. They just invaded the refugee camp, just straight up invaded it. And then when the Syrian army fought back against this invasion, and as well as the PLF-PGC fought back against it, the rebels kind of used this and said, look how Assad, the supposed enemy of Israel, is treating the Palestinians. He's bombing them. I think there was a mosque that got bombed. But what was really happening was the FSA, against the wishes of the residents in the camp, just invaded it.
Yeah. So, and with Palestinians, there were some Palestinians that did support the so-called rebels and the revolution. Nothing is totally monolithic.
One of them being Hamas.
But one of them being Hamas, yeah. But in general, as you mentioned, the Palestinians wanted to remain neutral. They didn't want these problems, and so they were just trying to stay out of it. But Yarmouk camp, which is considered like the capital of the Palestinian diaspora, where Palestinians had been treated well by the Syrian government. They were given all the rights of Syrian citizens, except for voting. But that didn't. It
wasn't like Lebanon, where you have like this kind of semi-apartheid system that exists for the Palestinians there.
Yeah, and in Lebanon, the Palestinians were stuck in the camps and didn't have the right to do most jobs. So Palestinians were treated very well by the Syrian government and really thrived in Yarmouk. And even Ariel Sharon, vowed that one day he would destroy Yarmouk, for example. And so, but Yarmouk is in a very strategic area. It's right in the southern suburbs of Damascus. Right. So these rebels, they had the CIA operation room, CIA and Saudi operation rooms in Jordan, where the weapons would first be sent. And then from there, the weapons for the so-called rebels would be sent across the border. And then, they wanted to move into Damascus and topple the government, of course. And so Yarmouk, being in the south of Damascus, was kind of like in the main supply line. And so the Nusra and FSA guys described it as the gateway to Damascus. So right. For them, it's really important for them to take over the camp and use it as a launching pad to then take over the capital as a whole. I think it's only like 4 or 5 kilometers from the presidential palace. So again, Palestinians just wanted to stay out of it, but the FSA and Nusra wanted to drag Palestinians into the conflict. And so, as you mentioned, in December 2012, they invaded the camp, and at that point, they created kind of a mini civil war within the camp, because Hamas, due to the influence, due to Qatar's influence over Hamas, And Qatar, of course, was a big backer of Al Qaeda and Nusra and the regime change operation alongside the U.S. and Israel. Hamas was influenced by Qatar, and so they actually took, the side of Al Qaeda, which means they took the side of Israel, and started fighting against the Syrian army. And so that kind of created a civil war style situation among Palestinians, where some of them ended up saying, okay, we're obviously with the government and we're going to fight against the so-called rebels. And then others, namely Hamas, were fighting with them. And so that fighting ended up resulting in the destruction, essentially, of Yarmouk. A lot of the destruction actually happened as well, even when I should say, before I get to that, the later on ISIS ended up entering the camp.
Yes.
Huge problem for the Syrian government. People would say, oh, why do you have a siege around Yarmouk camp and you hate Palestinians and you're trying to starve them? And the Syrian army is like, there's ISIS in the camp. And again, they're just a few kilometers from the presidential palace. Like, what government is not, like, what if there was ISIS, basically 3-4 kilometers from the White House? Like, this is a problem for any government and for any military. And so it's not that they were like targeting Palestinians. It's that, there was this problem. But again, in the media, you would hear about a siege around Yarmouk where Palestinians were getting killed, which sometimes they were by the army, or if they were getting arrested and detained, sometimes by the army and disappearing, which sometimes happened, which is terrible. But at the same time, it's like, well, there is ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in Yarmouk camp, and this is what the Syrian army and also their Palestinian allies from the PFLP GC, as you mentioned, that's what they were trying to prevent, was from ISIS from taking over the capital. So it was just much more complicated than that. But again, in all the propaganda was making it out like the Syrian government was anti-Palestinian, hated Palestinians. In fact,
which couldn't be further from the truth, by the way. Like, Syria was one of the main states, along with like Iran, from like the 80s, that was very ideologically against the state of Israel. You have Hafez's reaction to Ben David. You have one of the biggest backers of Hezbollah besides Iran. In fact, that was the main reason for the regime change, was because Syria was basically the supply line from Iran through Syria to Lebanon to Hezbollah. So that was one of the biggest justifications for why Israel, that was the real reason why they wanted to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. And I would say one thing regarding Hamas and their stance on the revolution, CIA-backed revolution, is that there was a realignment. There's always been a friction between the political wing and the military wing of Hamas. And there was kind of a realignment that happened with Iran and Syria with the rise of Yahya Sinwar around 2017 to the 2020s. And that's kind of where you get there was this famous speech where he said that if it wasn't for Iran, there would be no Palestinian resistance and the Arab states have abandoned us. But when he died, and then you also have Nasrallah died, and then Assad had fallen, the political wing of Hamas came out and congratulated the Syrian people and said that, this was a great day, yada, yada. And you look now, what does Syria look like now? And Palestinian resistance groups in Syria have basically been completely demilitarized. The PLF-PGC, those guys have been arrested. They've been forced to lay down their arms. Same thing with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Their guys have been arrested. And I don't think Hamas has actually visited Damascus yet, actually. And it's been 2 years since Jelani's taken power. And I don't even think they've visited. And there's been just attempt after attempt to break up the supply chains to Hezbollah from Iran. So if you look at what was happening under Assad to now, I mean, it's night and day. Couldn't even be more different. Couldn't be more obvious that Jelani is allied with the West and Israel in this question, and basically all questions.
Yeah, and I think that's a big reason there are many reasons. Again, they wanted to destroy Syria. The Israelis wanted to destroy the Syrian army. That was a big goal of theirs. And they want to basically, divide the country up into weak ethnic mini-states, as I mentioned, which is, happening, or which happened to a large extent And Druze in the south, Alawites in the coast, Sunnis in Damascus in the north, and the Kurds in the northeast. I mean, that's the type of fragmented, weak Syria that the Israelis want. And so that on top of a country that doesn't have a strong army. But then the other part of it was, if they put Jolani in power, then again, they can occupy more land, and one day, and he'll never bother them about giving the Golan Heights back.
And eventually, like they've been trying to pressure him to do, maybe you can get those guys who are still mad about Hezbollah's involvement in the civil war and maybe get him to get involved in Lebanon, as they've been pressuring him recently. But I don't think that'll happen. There is basically, I'm sure you know, that Jolani, while he controls Damascus, Syria is basically a failed state ruled by a bunch of warlords. There's not really a centralized command. There's not really any of that anymore. And the little military that Syria had left was basically destroyed by Israel's bombing campaigns that happened right after Assad fell, and they've been continue bombing Syria. Actually, I think a couple months ago during the Iran war, they bombed Syria.
Yeah. So again, it's just it's an indication that this was all done, for Israel's interest. But of course, they have to say the opposite. They have to say that, oh, we as Muslims, from Jabhat al-Nusra or from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or even ISIS, we're against Israel. That's what they always say. But in fact, covertly, they are allies and partners. And if you just, again, ignore the rhetoric, if you forget about what people say, because the Israelis still say that Jolani is a terrorist, and Jolani says that he's opposed to the Israelis occupying, Syria. But if you just look at the actions of the different parties, and you look at the outcomes, and you look at the results, that's when you can see who's really allies and who's really enemies. And it's the same with Turkey.
Right.
President Erdogan, he's constantly, the Israelis are committing genocide, and we support Gaza. But in all of Erdogan's actions, they do not, the Turks are constantly helping the Israelis, sending them oil, helping them, sending them steel, other raw materials, trading with them. So that's maybe a whole nother topic, but there's constantly this issue of people kind of assuming that people are enemies because they talk like they're enemies. And that's just not a good way to evaluate or to understand really what's going on.
Well, Jelani, even with one of the first things he said when he took power, is that our problem's not with Israel, right? And so Jelani kind of, and the people who support Jelani, influencers and whatnot, they kind of have a perfect excuse for why Jelani won't do anything towards Israel, because they're trying to rebuild, and eventually, once we become strong again, then we're going to go liberate Jerusalem. Yeah, I'm sure that will eventually happen. There was a deal that was just signed with Syria and America involving Israel to basically destroy the little nuclear program that Syria had left. They got rid of 99% of it. They're getting rid, and Jelani is in lockstep, any type of sovereignty that Syria could have. And I didn't know this until I read your book, that Israel was basically involved and basically set the policy of the famous red line, and chemical weapons being a red line. That was basically an Israeli policy that was picked up by the U.S.
Yeah. So, for example, Syria, their chemical weapons program was developed by Hafez al-Assad in the 70s and the 80s. And the idea of having chemical weapons was as a deterrent to Israel. Israel has nukes and a very powerful air force and the backing of the United States. But if Syria has chemical weapons, that could be a deterrent towards Israel. So, as you mentioned, in August of 2012, President Obama came out and said, well, hey, if Bashar al-Assad ends up using chemical weapons against his own people, this would be a red line. And this would cause me to order, the U.S. military to intervene in Syria in the way that NATO intervened in Libya. And so as soon as Obama said that,
same month,
this is incentive that tells, the Al Qaeda groups on the ground fighting Assad, and also the intelligence agencies supporting those Al Qaeda fighters, the Saudis, the Turks, the CIA, and the Mossad, that, hey, if you can just do a fake chemical attack, blame it on the Syrian government, then you're going to get American, French, British warplanes dropping bombs on Damascus in the same way that they dropped them on Tripoli in Libya. And, maybe you'll see Bashar al-Assad getting dragged through the streets and, sodomized.
Have a bayonet shoved up his ass.
Just like Gaddafi did. And so as soon as Obama said that, there were these constant series of small false flag chemical attacks that then culminated in a major false flag chemical attack a year later in August 2013. And again, it was very convincing psychological operation where, at least a couple hundred, maybe even over 1,000 people were killed in this false flag that was actually done by the rebels, but blamed on Assad. And Obama was very, very close to going ahead and ordering this massive military intervention, and he backed off at just the last minute. But what's interesting is that suddenly Sergei Lavrov, out of the blue, comes to Secretary of State Kerry and says, well, hey, why don't you call off the bombing if we can arrange for Assad to give up his chemical weapons and have them destroyed? And Kerry was like, okay, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And Obama wanted an excuse to get out of actually ordering the bombing because he knew it was illegal. He knew that, it was basically fake, the chemical attack. He must have known that. And he's like, if I order this military intervention and it doesn't go well, I remember how George Bush got blamed for the debacle of Iraq. I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want the Republicans in the Senate to try to impeach me. So he got cold feet. And then all of a sudden Lavrov comes to him and says, and him and Kerry, and says, hey, why don't you just, we'll get Assad to give up his chemical weapons, and then, then that's a win for you, and everyone's happy. And so that's what happened, and Assad was convinced. But the thing is that, and a lot of people who supported the Syrian government and knew that Assad didn't do the chemical attack, they were like, oh yeah, we kind of came out ahead because look, the U.S. never did the military intervention. But who was celebrating that outcome? That suddenly
Israel.
Syria had no more chemical weapons. Netanyahu was celebrating it. And then, as you mentioned, it turns out that Obama was not the first person who brought up this idea of a red line that the U.S. would intervene if Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. In fact, this idea of a red line was initially brought up and promoted by the Israelis. And then Obama ended up repeating it, either naively or maybe on purpose, I'm not sure. But once he repeated that thing, okay, it's a red line for Assad to use chemical weapons, then it was game on for the intelligence agencies, the Saudis, the CIA, the Turks, and the Israelis to stage a big false flag attack that would induce the Western intervention in best case scenario, or, as a consolation prize, they got rid of Assad's chemical weapons. And again, that deterrent was suddenly gone. What if Assad had that as a deterrent? In the future against Israel, that would have obviously been a big help to him. But it was a big win for the Israelis.
Just for the audience, I kind of want to elaborate on why it was so obvious that these supposed attacks using chemical weapons were so fake. The first known one happened, the first really big one happened in August of 2012, literally a few weeks after Obama said the thing about the red line. And I believe it happened in Khan al-Assad. I forget how to pronounce it, something like that. And the thing is, and the reason why we know that this was the rebels who did it was because the only people who died in it were either civilians or the Syrian army. And Assad invited the UN to come investigate this and saying, look, the rebels are using chemical weapons. Look, they have the capabilities. It was them who did this. It was not me. Come in and investigate it. And the U.S. and France and Britain started, and the UN agreed to this. And the West started adding all these other places in Syria for them to investigate, to basically further and push back and make it more difficult for the investigation to happen. Well, then in 2013, when the UN finally comes in to investigate this attack, like literally 3 days after the UN came in, the very large chemical attack that you talked about, the one in Ghouta, happened. And the reason why that was probably a false flag was, why would Assad use chemical weapons when the UN just got there to investigate chemical weapons usage that he invited? And something else that happened right before the attack in Ghouta was a large raid carried out by Nusra and the FSA and ISIS on an Alawite town on the coast. And a lot of people were saying, which I think is true, that a lot of bodies, dead bodies that were shown in the Ghouta attack were actually victims of this raid. They were Alawites, victims of this raid that had been brought to Ghouta, already dead, and shown in the videos.
Yeah, so the town you mentioned was Khan al-Asl, which is just outside of Aleppo. And that attack was actually a little bit later than you said. It was in March 2013.
Okay.
And so it was even closer to the event. So like you said,
Right.
you know, there was a chemical attack using sarin, and it killed Syrian soldiers. And so Assad was like, hey, this is a slam dunk for us. Well, let's get the UN in here and investigate. And then, as you mentioned, as soon as, you know, there's all these US and Britain suddenly were like, oh, well, you know, we can't just investigate that one chemical attack. You got to investigate this other one, this other one, this other one, which there was no evidence that real chemical attacks actually happened. But they were trying to muddy the waters, you know, and so that it wasn't just this clear-cut case of actually, you know, the rebels using chemical weapons. So, and then again, once a couple months later, when the UN investigators finally arrived in Damascus, and just days later, all of a sudden, there's this chemical attack. And so the UN investigators that came to investigate the case a few months before in Khan al-Asl, suddenly they're like, oh, well, let's forget about that for now. There's this new chemical attack we got to investigate.
Right.
And then, you know, there are many, many reasons why it's clear it's a false flag. If people really want all the details, they could read my book, because I talk a lot about it in probably too much detail. But again, one of the big instances or ways to show it was that there was as soon as the chemical attack happened, all these videos suddenly got uploaded online and just went viral, and then they're shown on Al Jazeera and CNN, showing the victims of the chemical attack. And there was this one particular video that shows all these bodies laid out in a morgue that, you know, people supposedly killed by sarin. And in this video, there's one particular guy who appears to be dead, and he's just laying there on the floor of this room along with all these other bodies. And that was one video that got released and spread around online, released by these opposition activists saying, look, we're filming the people who were killed in this chemical attack by Assad's army. But then there was another video of the same room with all these same bodies that was released, separate video, but of the same room, same bodies, but from a few hours later. And all of a sudden, if you look close, there's one guy who presumably was already dead from the previous video. All of a sudden, in the second video, he's got this cloth, this bloody cloth over his neck, and there's all this huge pool of blood behind his head. And so what it indicates is that, in fact, somehow he survived. He wasn't actually dead in the first video. He was unconscious somehow, came to, and the people who were supposedly, you know, there to save him, because there's all these like nurses kind of going around the room in the different videos, like injecting people with random things. All of a sudden, these people noticed, hey, this guy is not dead. So what did they do? They just slit his throat.
Slit his throat, yeah.
And then that's why he bled. And all of a sudden, they had to put this like towel over his neck, and there's a big pool of blood under him. Anyway, so that's an indication that, you know, sarin, if you die from sarin, there are certain characteristics of what happens to the color of your skin, what happens to your eyes, what happens to like your mouth foaming and things like this. And in the victims that were supposedly killed by sarin, you don't see those actual characteristics. You see characteristics of their bodies that are more indicative of them suffocating from like carbon monoxide poisoning. So again, this is a pretty elaborate stuff. That's how crazy these psychological operations got during the Syrian war, where probably a bunch of Alawites, as you mentioned, were kidnapped. We don't know from where exactly, but a lot of Alawites were held in this area called the Ghouta, where the attack happened, in prisons of a rebel group called Jaish al-Islam. They called it the Toba prison, or the repentance prison. They had thousands of Alawites captured.
Well, they would parade them around in cages. They would
parade them around in cages. So probably, we don't know for sure, but they took some of these Alawites that had been imprisoned or taken captive, and they put them in a room, filled it full of carbon monoxide, just like you would if you're in your car and want to commit suicide, and you go into the garage and turn the exhaust on and keep the doors closed. That carbon monoxide, killed a bunch of people. And then they took the bodies, laid them all out, and said, "Hey, look, these people died from sarin." But again, the characteristics of their bodies did not match dying from sarin. And then in that one instance, they literally cut this guy's throat. So these are, the indications that that it was fake. But again, the whole idea was to induce a Western intervention, just like what happened in Libya. And in fact, the British in 2012, before Obama actually issued this red line comment, there was a major offensive, like a rebel offensive, into Damascus in the summer of 2012. And there was a British general, I forget his name, unfortunately, but there was a British general who was preparing to do a big intervention into Damascus. The British military and Air Force would bomb from the sky, and they had partnered with these rebels on the ground. But the prime minister at the time, I think it was David Cameron, he got cold feet and said, "Hey, I don't want to do it." And this British general was complaining about it. He said they had plans prepared, just like in Libya. He specifically cited Libya as the example, because the NATO bombing successfully kicked Gaddafi out. And he even was making comments about David Cameron, calling him a pussy, and he's like, coward, and things like this. So anyways, in the summer of 2012, it didn't happen. There wasn't enough of an excuse to do a big military intervention. But then a year passes, and you get the fake chemical attack, and suddenly that was enough to push it, much closer. And again, that failed as well. But then there were some later chemical attacks in later years in a place called Khan Sheikhoun, and in 2017, then another one in Douma in the Damascus suburbs in 2018, where additional fake chemical attacks, were carried out. And then there was this whole controversy with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the UN watchdog, that investigated these attacks, but, they couldn't admit that it was the rebels who had done it. So they ended up doctoring all their reports. And
was there like a WikiLeaks something where an email got leaked of the people on the ground who were investigating these, like their opinions weren't actually put in the final release of the OPCW report of one of the chemical weapons attacks, and like the guys on the ground, like their conclusions weren't actually present in the document? I believe that was something like that, where WikiLeaks email exposed that, something to that effect.
Yeah, so it wasn't WikiLeaks, but
it wasn't WikiLeaks.
This was regarding the 2018 chemical attack. And again, in this case, the investigators from the OPCW had a chance to go to Damascus and actually go to the sites and investigate. And the investigators on the ground found that, look, this was not a chemical attack. There's no way that these cylinders allegedly falling from helicopters could have landed where they landed and done the damage to the building that they did. Even one supposedly canister full of chlorine, which is not even like usually deadly, supposedly was dropped from a helicopter, smashed through the roof, the concrete of a building, bounced off the side of the wall, traveled 3 meters to the other side of the room, and then softly landed on a bed without destroying the bed. And this was supposedly the scenario, and then released all this chlorine, which again is not even usually a chemical weapon and is not typically deadly, and supposedly killed like 40 people in this building. the whole thing was just really ridiculous. But when these, when the OPCW investigators were on the ground, they wrote up their report and basically said, look, this is not plausible that there was a chlorine attack that killed these people. But the higher ups in the OPCW just went ahead and just erased or deleted all this evidence, rewrote the report a bunch of times. And so then later, some of the emails of one of the investigators who was on the ground, named Brendan Whelan, he's writing to his superiors in the OPCW saying, hey, why are you totally changing the reports? Like, the conclusions you're writing in this report, that's not what we found at all. And why did you leave out this? We had a toxicology test and we had this engineering test, and you're just left out all this evidence. What's going on? Those emails ended up getting leaked. And so there's two people in particular that wrote a lot about this and documented it. One is a really great researcher named Piers Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is Aaron Mate from the Gray Zone. So they both covered that really, really well, if people are interested in that whole controversy.
Right. Yes. One thing when it comes to the chemical weapons is just the time that they happened. It didn't really make any sense, even from like a military point of view, because in 2013, it didn't really make any sense for Assad to use chemical weapons because they had just retaken, I think Qusar, I think that's how I pronounce it, which was a big supply chain from weapons coming in from foreign countries. And then by like 2017, 2018, I mean, they had essentially won the war. Right around that time, it had basically been won, so it didn't really make any sense for the usage of chemical weapons. And a lot of the evidence that America was citing, the pictures and satellite images, etc., that was coming from Israel. During the Obama administration, and certainly during Trump with Adelson and Kushner in his ear, so much of and it's the same thing with Iran now, so much of the supposed information that they're getting is coming from Israel. But a lot of the supposed evidence that America had of chemical weapons was just coming from Israel, and most of it was just fake. It just wasn't true.
Yeah, so again, the Israelis played a big role in this way. So after the chemical attack in 2013, when Obama, in the first few days after the attack, when Obama announced that, hey, I'm going to do the intervention, but he was getting cold feet, suddenly a delegation of Israelis showed up.
Yep.
In Washington, to lobby, and a bunch of the evidence or intelligence that supposedly showed that Assad, his government had carried out the chemical attack, including like some intercepted phone calls. All of that came from the Israelis, and it was all just fabricated. But the Israelis were using that to, try to basically force Obama's hand. And, it's interesting, just today, literally just today, there was a report in the Washington Post where a couple weeks ago, when Trump was at a summit in Turkey, having talks with Erdogan at a NATO summit, he allegedly got this intelligence that Iran was going to assassinate him.
Mm-hmm.
And so he got off of Air Force One, his plane, when he was in Turkey, as he was going to fly home. The Secret Service, had him secretly exit the plane and get into a food catering truck, and they transported him to a totally separate airplane to then fly back to the UK with an F-16 escorts. But Trump was literally scared that he was going to be assassinated by the Iranians, and because they got a warning from the Israelis that the Iranians were going to assassinate him. And then just today in the Washington Post, these U.S. officials and the CIA, they came out and said, look, that intelligence came from Israel. We don't believe it. It's fantastical. It's weak. And, the Israelis are releasing this intelligence just to try to manipulate the president.
Right.
So, obviously that was not a really important example or anything, but it was literally today, the story about the Israelis doing that exact same thing, but just on a much smaller scale today.
Well, Israel drug us into this war, right? I mean, Marco Rubio fucked up a little bit and basically admitted that himself, that the reason why we went in is because we knew Israel was going to launch a preemptive strike. So we went in them we went in with them. There was false information that Iran, was planning to do something that was completely false. No evidence that Iran was planning on attacking Israel. No evidence of a nuclear weapon as well. And there's really, ever since this, for decades and decades, Iran, I don't think, has seriously tried to have a nuclear weapon. I think their policy is having a latent nuclear deterrence, just showing that we can make this if we want to, but, we don't want to, don't make us. But now I think the situation's kind of changed since we've actually attacked Iran and gone into a full-fledged war. I think they're completely justified in having a nuclear bomb. I think they've always actually been justified in having a nuclear bomb. Israel has one. I don't understand why they can't have one. And even going into, speaking of Israeli sabotage, going back into the Obama administration during the JCPOA negotiations, Israel tried multiple times to sabotage that. They were assassinating nuclear scientists in Iran in 2011 and 2012. They were very upset about this deal that was going to be signed. And then once the deal was signed, the big AIPAC congressmen in Congress just did nothing but speak about how they were going to sabotage this and how they were going to get out of this through Congress. And then eventually Trump comes in and Adelson gives them $100 million and he rips it up and he kills Soleimani, and they continue the dirty war on Syria, which was, in my opinion, basically a proxy against Iran. And, but yeah, for decades and decades on this specific issue, Israel's just done nothing but sabotage to try to get America into situations that obviously doesn't benefit our national security interest.
Yeah, and we've been talking for a while now, and so hopefully I've emphasized this enough in the past, but maybe if I haven't, I'll try to do it now, which is to say, basically everything in regarding foreign policy, the Israelis and their Jewish American allies here in the United States are the ones controlling these policies and trying to manipulate and push the U.S. government into fighting these wars. They're always for Israel. I mean, oil companies, weapons manufacturers make a lot of money off this stuff. A lot of people made a lot of money off the Iraq War, for example. But every scenario I look at, the deeper you go into checking about this conflict or that, the Israelis and the Jewish lobby in the United States, or Jewish members of, like, say, the State Department or the CIA or different presidential administrations, or Jewish journalists, they're constantly putting out the propaganda. They're always there. They're always there. And it took me a long time to realize that, especially about the Iraq War. Again, I was in Iraq, as I mentioned, way back in 2005. And there was some sense back then that, the Iraq War was about oil. But because I was reading too much Noam Chomsky back then, I didn't realize that, in fact, the Iraq War was fought to get oil, not for Americans, but for Israel.
Right.
That was the main reason for the Iraq War, was to break up Iraq into the, again, weaken it because it was an enemy, but also access oil, specifically oil from the northern Iraq, from Kirkuk. It's a bit of a complicated story, so maybe won't go into it unless you're interested. But this was the reason for the Iraq War, and all of the people who pushed the policy in Iraq, not only to launch the war, but then also to make sure that the occupation went badly and that a sectarian civil war broke out. This was done on purpose. It wasn't just like bumbling or mistakes. This was a deliberate policy to spark the sectarian war and try to make the country collapse. All of it was done by pro-Israel people. And it wasn't just neocons. There were a lot of liberals, like Jewish liberals, who pushed the policy too. I mean, the neocons, they get, the credit because they were at the forefront and they were the ones actually in power at the time. But a lot of the groundwork for the invasion of Iraq was laid during the Clinton administration.
Yes.
Like Martin Indyk, and again, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and people in the Council on Foreign Relations, people like Peter Galbraith. again, that were promoting these lies about Saddam, doing a genocide against the Kurds. So it was really a bipartisan effort. But again, I don't know if you feel the same, maybe you feel differently, but the older I get, the more I just see that there's
No, I'm
Israeli
definitely on the same page
hands
with
in
you
all this
right
stuff.
there. Definitely on the same page when it comes to Israel and their dominance over American foreign policy. You mentioned Bill Clinton. I remember there was this famous quote from Clinton during the Iraq War. Or, no, I'm sorry. John Mearsheimer quotes it in his book, The Israel Lobby, and it was Clinton saying that he didn't know a single Israeli that didn't support overthrowing Saddam Hussein. And we mentioned Chomsky earlier, and you just did then. There's always this leftist current to blame American foreign policy, specifically our policy in the Middle East, on oil and big business and just general imperialism and things of that nature. But if you really look into it, it's not really. I mean, they do make money on this. Don't get me wrong, but as you said, Israel and the oil pipeline. I believe there was a book published by the Libertarian Institute. It's called Israel, the Winner of the Iraq War, and that heavily goes into the how Israel significantly benefited in oil when it comes to the Iraq War. And you notice something as well. A lot of these liberals that push this stuff about the Iraq War, they were against it. Then you look at Syria. Many of them supported the dirty war on Syria. There were many of them that supported the dirty war on Syria because they did this whole moderate revolution nonsense and talked about the Kurds and how the Kurds had this weird anarcho-communist democratic confederate system over there in Syria, and they supported that. And I've always saw that narrative as kind of a psyop, basically, to focus on this and not what's actually going on with Israel. And even sometimes we'll give covert support for dirty wars that Israel and the United States wage on the enemies of Israel.
Yeah, and I guess to go back to Chomsky a little bit, because I had read so many of his books. I was really just misguided when it came to the whole reasons about everything about 9/11, the actual causes of the so-called war on terror. And Chomsky's MO seemed to be to basically blame everything bad that the United States does, which is very real things, of course. But it was basically to kind of make sure no one understood that Israel and the Jewish lobby in the US was responsible, and basically blame it on like whoever happened to be president at the time.
And he has significant interest in doing that because he's Jewish. And as we found out with the Epstein files, he was connected to Jeffrey Epstein, who was a Mossad agent.
Yeah. And so, for example, when it came to, like, if you ever read his stuff about Vietnam and JFK, he talks about JFK like JFK is Hitler. I mean, he makes it out like JFK was the one responsible for killing, 2 million Vietnamese in Vietnam, that everything bad that happened during that time was JFK's fault. And then when you study some more history and you realize, actually, JFK was trying to get out of Vietnam. He was trying to prevent the Israelis from getting a nuclear bomb. And he was really opposed to the Israel lobby. And he actually was a pretty good guy. I mean, he's still a president. I'm sure, it's not like I love JFK or anything, maybe in many ways he probably was shitty. I'm not trying to say he's like, some hero, but the way Chomsky talked about him was like, he was literally like the devil. And Chomsky would never bring up, would never question that, he was assassinated by like a lone gunman or whatever. And it was the same thing even with like Ronald Reagan. Like if you read Chomsky's stuff about the 80s, it was like Ronald Reagan was responsible for all the atrocities in Central America, like in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas. That Reagan was responsible for like everything that, happened in Lebanon, the Israelis did in Lebanon, on and on and on. But it's like Reagan, he was an actor.
Right.
The dude was a Hollywood actor. Do we think that Ronald Reagan had any fucking clue or much of a clue what was going on with all these crazy things that were happening. And then you look at it, and like the Israelis were behind all these things. And even Reagan, when the Israelis were bombing Lebanon in 1982, and just destroying entire residential apartment buildings, which they have done again in 2024 and in this last war a few months ago. When the Israelis were doing that in 1982, Reagan was pissed off, and he was calling up, if I remember, as Menachem Begin or maybe Sharon, and saying, "Hey, you guys need to knock this the fuck off, or I'm going to cut off aid to you guys." Like, so again, it's not that Reagan was a good guy; he was a piece of shit, I'm sure. But Chomsky would redirect all the bad things that were happening away from the Israelis really being the cause, and put it on whoever just happened to be the president, who was just a figurehead, So that was.
I have a lot to say actually about this topic, about the kind of leftist influence in the anti-war movement, because a lot of them are Jewish and a lot of them misdirect the where the actual power is, right? And speaking of Chomsky, there was a clip of Norman Finkelstein talking about Chomsky, and he said Chomsky himself went to Lebanon and talked to Nasrallah, and Finkelstein said, and I'm not a fan of Finkelstein either, but Finkelstein said that Chomsky was basically trying to pacify Nasrallah and get him on board with the whole, it's the oil lobby and it's American imperialism and Israel is like this outpost of American European colonialism or whatever. And you saw a shift in Nasrallah's rhetoric. And so why is this guy, who's supposedly this anti-war activist in the United States, going and speaking to like actual resistance organizations and basically giving him ideological training on to say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable to the West? And Finkelstein's another example of this kind of leftist Jewish influence that you see. And you have the general Jewish Voices for Peace and If Not Now and whatever. And the talking points are just all wrong, I mean, Finkelstein is saying that left-wing pro-Palestinian activists shouldn't unite with right-wing ones. You shouldn't pay attention to guys like Tucker Carlson and Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene. But why not? Why the hell not? They're saying things that are right. How come you can't unite on this one issue? And then when it comes to like If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, I mean, they're getting funded by fucking George Soros and these guys, right? So you could see where this is going. And these are one of the biggest organizers of the pro-Palestinian protests. And they're getting money from Soros, who's a Jew who was involved in all the colored revolutions in the United States. And who's another one that I can think of? Another one's Jeffrey Sachs, who was a head guy in the shock therapy in Russia that destroyed Russia's economy for a decade. And this is kind of, I've just noticed this pattern of Jewish leftists getting involved specifically in this issue, but then their rhetoric and their points are completely misguiding people on like where the actual power is and other subversive actions.
Yeah, and so for example, another example of Chomsky was about 9/11, because I was probably like a sophomore in college when 9/11 happened. And so I, at that time, was a big Chomsky fan. So I basically was, following his line on 9/11, which was, I found a video kind of recently where he comes out and says he's making fun of people who think that the Twin Towers came down in a way that was not, as a result of the planes. And he basically said, there's no reason to doubt George Bush's account of what happened on 9/11. And so Chomsky reiterated the narrative that Al-Qaeda is real, that Al-Qaeda did the attacks as some type of blowback, and that the way that 9/11 went down, the exact way that George Bush claims it went down.
Ridiculous.
Well, how crazy is that? And so the whole thing about that it was just a huge misdirection. And so people like me who were good leftists, we never even thought to question that 9/11 was an inside job. All we thought was like, oh, well, the U.S. is going overboard in their reaction. The U.S. military is just reacting to Al-Qaeda. The war on terror is just this kind of like excessive measure. rather than something that was, initiated by Israel, and that 9/11 was the vehicle to launch these wars and get the United States to fight all these wars against these 7 countries in 5 years that Israel wanted it to fight. But Israel wants the U.S. to pay for it. Israel wants U.S. soldiers to die. Israel wants, which again, we're seeing now with the current Iran war. It's just history repeating itself. But this was all Chomsky's misdirection. And the other thing, if you ever hear him talk about the Israeli lobby or the Jewish lobby.
Yeah, he wrote a whole article trying to refute John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt on it. He got so mad at Mearsheimer and Walt for saying that it's Israel lobby that dictates our policy on the Middle East. He got so mad about that, he had to write an entire article in response to it. It was ridiculous.
And there's one video where I heard him say, how could a small ethnic lobby be more powerful than, McDonnell Douglas or Raytheon or something, And it's like, if you just, again, look very closely in detail about how all these wars began and who was pushing them and who was starting them and who was making the decisions, in almost in all these cases, they are American Jews who were loyal to Israel. And Chomsky again says, no, how could these people possibly, it's imperialism, it's capitalism, it's these words that are just these vague, amorphous words that don't mean anything really. How are you as an activist going to oppose capitalism? How are you as an activist going to oppose imperialism?
And they also make it
yeah.
Well, they make it, one thing I've noticed, and I think this is also deliberate, which is they turn it into an intersectionality thing, and they even trying to make it racial. With, they say that Israel's this white supremacist settler colonial state, and, it's an offshoot of the British Empire, and America kept supporting it. None of that's true, right? In fact, the majority of Israelis are not even the white Jews, they're Mizrahi. And some of the most insane genocidal Jews in the state of Israel are Mizrahi, one being Smotrich, he's Egyptian, Ben Gvir is Iraqi. So, you have that, but as well, patriotic white Americans that prefer a more non-interventionist policy, they would get on board with this anti-Israel stuff, and you're seeing it now in the aftermath of October 7th. But before that, they would get on board with that if you weren't saying that Israel's this white supremacist state and bringing all this other nonsense into the equation, And so that turned a lot of people off to it. And I think that was done on purpose to make the pro-Palestinian movement in the West a niche faction of leftism, and not this kind of, what you're kind of seeing now with this unity in the left and right kind of shaking hands on this with guys like Carlson and the Young Turks and whatnot. But, another example of this kind of leftist rejection of this kind of thinking, Chomsky said that about 9/11. Finkelstein said the same thing about JFK and said that JFK conspiracies that involve Israel are just kookery, and you shouldn't pay attention to them and things like that. And it's like, well, what about old boy that killed him and said that when he went to prison and the rabbi came to him, he said, I did this for the Jewish people after he killed Lee Harvey Oswald, Ruby. And that's what he said. And these guys all obviously have connections. They're all Jewish and they have connections to the mob, and the mob was connected to Israel. There was a Jewish mafia. There wasn't just an Italian mafia, and a lot of guys involved in the JFK assassination were connected to it.
Yeah, Meyer Lansky and his whole gang, and
yep.
he was running guns to the Irgun or the Lehi, the Zionist terrorist groups before Israel was created. So yeah, again, it's it's just a bunch of misdirection, and sometimes it's hard to know what is delivered, what is not. I mean, again, a lot of the things that I'm critical of now, I believed years before I learned better. But with people like Chomsky, they do know better. And again, when you start, you can start to see over time the tricks that they're pulling. You can start to identify the patterns and say, like, okay, now I see that the games that he's playing. And but I think you're right, especially about the white supremacy stuff. Half the articles you read about like white privilege, or there's supposedly some white guy in like liberal magazines saying, white people are evil, and wouldn't it be good if white people just, aborted all their kids and never had any kids and just disappeared off the face of the earth. And I'm saying that as a white person, like I'm a white person. I think white people should just, disappear. And then you look at the name of the person on the article. It's like, Goldberg. Like, why are all these Jewish people telling me about how evil white people are? You know what I mean?
And then
So
you ask their
this
opinion
game.
about Israel, and you ask their opinions about Palestinians, and
Yeah, or about immigration. I mean, I'm very, I always, I'm supportive of like refugees. I did like so much volunteering with Iraqi refugees when I was, living in the States for years and years. And I think it's really important to support refugees, who are have to flee their homes, especially because of U.S. and Israeli violence. And if we can make a home for them in the United States, like I'm so supportive of that. But at the same time, you see there are these, basically Jewish NGOs facilitating, mass immigration, which is not, families, like desperate families fleeing from a war zone. It's usually, military age men that, of course, I don't even blame them. They're, want to come to the United States for a better life. But why is there this insistence on we have to admit huge numbers of immigrants? And it's more pronounced, the pattern is more pronounced in Europe, especially in places like Ireland,
Right. Well, this is a good point you bring up, right? Because, you wrote the book on Syria. There was this big Israeli NGO that was transferring Syrian refugees to Europe, Israel. It's like, well, hold on now. You caused this war. You basically caused this. And then you're taking these people and you're bringing them to Europe. Same thing happened in Libya. Actually, Gaddafi had made a deal with the Italian government to crack down on illegal immigration coming through the Mediterranean. And then once Gaddafi was overthrown, one of the largest refugee crises you had seen, until Syria happened, which was a year or so later. But that was Israel to the United States, and so if you stop this war and causing these refugees, which then Israel uses and facilitates to bring them to Europe, you wouldn't have that. If you just stop the war, you would stop a lot of the immigration crisis that you see. And a lot of the people who are engineers of the wars are also engineers of bringing these people to Europe. Because God fucking forbid Israel takes in some war refugees that they cause. That's never going to happen. And a lot of the time, these guys would go to Europe, they go to England, and they would get ideological training in these Wahhabist mosques, and then they go back to Syria and join ISIS. That also happened a good bit of times.
Yeah. So again, I like to be like welcoming of refugees and immigrants. But you start to see this pattern where, the same people who are pushing the wars are also pushing a lot of the mass immigration in a very organized way. And again, in a place like Ireland, maybe in the United States, you can say, well, white people like me, we came from Europe, and so we're like settlers, and this was originally Native American land, which it was. A lot of parts of the Southwest were originally Mexico. And my opinion is, if a lot of like Hispanics or people from Mexico or South or Central America come to the United States, like I'm great with that, especially since the U.S. caused all these wars in the 80s, in Central America. But it takes a different character when you look at a place like Ireland. Like, why are there Jewish NGOs pushing mass immigration into Ireland, where the Irish are an indigenous population? They're not, settlers or colonists, and yet their country is being overwhelmed, by immigrants in just a very organized way that doesn't make any sense, in a way that's not the local society is not able to absorb the people. And it's because there is a deliberate effort to, basically overwhelm the Irish demographically and basically have them become a minority in their own country. You see the same thing in places like Sweden, where there's a lot of videos of this one Jewish woman, American woman, who's promoting immigration into Sweden, saying that, the Swedes need to learn how to be diverse and all this stuff. It's like, well, look, if Swedes want to be Swedes in their own country and have a majority be Swedish, like that's same with Japan. Like, why, Japan, if they want Japan to stay Japanese, like, and again, you ask these same people, okay, fine. Well, if Sweden and Ireland have all these refugees, how about Israel? And as you said, that's, oh, well, Israel is different because, we're the Jewish people and blah, 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 blah. So anyways, you just start to see the games that, that these people are playing. And it's a bit off the topic of the Middle East, sorry, but.
Going a little bit back to the middle, one thing to add there is some of the biggest pushers of Europe accepting refugees when it comes to in Israel are guys like in the Likud party, like Smotrich, or even more radicals like Ben Gvir. I remember this plan was written up in the Knesset. It was an op-ed written in the Wall Street Journal by Smotrich, and Ben Gvir praised it and whatnot, and was basically saying that Europe needs to accept 40,000 Palestinian refugees that have been displaced because we started this genocide in Gaza. That's an example. It's like, why don't you just give them the right to return? They come to you. Why do we have to accept them? But,
if Palestinians, wanted to come to Europe or to America and have the chance, I would be supportive of that. But you can see the games the Israelis are playing. And in fact, right in like a few days after 7th of October, there was a leaked planning document from the Israeli intelligence ministry that talked about how they wanted to basically ethnically cleanse Gaza, but they wanted to do it in a way that made it seem humanitarian, like it would be merciful to allow Palestinians to leave Gaza. So the idea was the Israelis would start killing so many people and destroy Gaza so thoroughly that it would seem like the humanitarian, good Samaritan thing to do, to have them go to Egypt and live
Egypt.
in
Yeah, Egypt was a big one. Egypt and Jordan.
Live in concentration camps in the Sinai. But then again, as you mentioned, there was these op-eds where they started saying, yeah, well, Spain, the Palestinians could go to Spain, Palestinians could go to Ireland. And it's like, look, if Palestinians did want to do that, of course, I would be totally supportive. I would welcome them into the United States. Like, I would feel blessed if Palestinians came, but you cannot commit a genocide against Palestinians that don't want to come to the United States. They want to live peacefully in their lands and in their homes. And anyway, so you could just see that the fake agenda behind all this. It's all this fake humanitarianism.
Well, Palestinians don't want to, this is kind of obvious, but, Palestinians don't want to come to the United States or Europe. They want to go back to their homeland, and they can't because Israel won't let them. There's this one Palestinian activist, her name's Dr. Rahmet in Britain, and she's much more, on this kind of line, and talks about, she doesn't have a problem with white British people wanting Britain to stay white, and that she would even willing to be deported. But if she's going to be deported, deport her to Palestine. You can't deport me to Jordan or Egypt. You bring me to Palestine. And that's how I feel about this stuff, man. If it wasn't for, I don't like when people have their homes destroyed and have to flee their country. But the solution to that, in my opinion, is not in massive boats to give them a new home in Europe. No, you don't destroy their home. Don't destroy their home. So that's how I feel about it. But to go a little bit back into what your research has been in, because we're only going to talk for a little, we've been going for a long time, but you wrote some stuff about this, and I really want you to go into it. ISIS, the Islamic State, how much of ISIS's growth was due to the Syrian revolution, and how did the United States allow ISIS to go all the way into Mosul?
Yeah, so again, the ISIS and its offshoots, the Nusra Front in Syria, these were all U.S. and Israeli creations, again, with help from the Turks and from Qatar. And in the case of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, with major help from the Kurds in Iraq, Masoud Barzani and the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which most people don't know. And again, there was one evidence of this, for example, is there was a Defense Intelligence Agency document from 2012 that talked about how it was, the powers supporting the Syrian opposition, which includes the United States, wanted to create a quote unquote Salafist principality
Mm.
in eastern Syria and western Iraq. And that was in 2012. And, basically 2 years later, after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared the caliphate from a mosque in Mosul, that caliphate that ISIS controlled covered the exact essential territory that was described in that Defense Intelligence Agency document saying that is exactly what the U.S. wanted, was an extremist Sunni Muslim state encompassing, eastern Syria and western Iraq. And the idea, again, was to break up Syria, make it weak, break up Iraq, make it weak. So the United States, with the help of the Saudis, with the help of the Turks, et cetera, they were pumping weapons into groups like the Free Syrian Army groups, knowing that these weapons would then immediately just get passed on to the Nusra Front, that the weapons would immediately get passed on to ISIS. And in the case of Iraq and Mosul, there was actually a specific, like the fall of Mosul to ISIS was actually planned.
Mm.
It wasn't just kind of like, oh, ISIS grew and then shocked everyone and took over Mosul, and Nouri al-Maliki, the Iraqi prime minister, was just really sectarian. He was Shiite, and he was so sectarian that the Sunnis in places like Mosul and Fallujah and Ramadi had no choice but to just accept ISIS because they hated Maliki so much. That was the narrative, but the reality is the United States was deliberately supplying weapons to ISIS that they were purchasing in Eastern Europe and having the Saudis fly from like Croatia and Serbia to Jordan, and then sending the weapons across the border to ISIS. And they had them take over Mosul. And again, the Kurds were providing weapons to ISIS as well. And the idea was that if ISIS could take over Mosul and western Iraq and cause the Iraqi army to collapse, this would then provide an excuse for Masoud Barzani's Kurdish Peshmerga to then take advantage of that chaos and go and take over Kirkuk, which has huge amounts of oil. And then taking over Kirkuk would allow the Kurds to have like the economic base to form their own country and become independent, which was an Israeli project going back decades.
Mm.
So basically there was an arrangement between ISIS and the Kurds. A lot of the Iraqi army units in Mosul at the time had Kurdish commanders. And so they basically told their units not to fight against ISIS and to withdraw. And then that caused the Iraqi army to collapse. And then the Peshmerga then took the chance to go with the Iraqi army in a state of chaos to take over Kirkuk and get the oil that they had wanted for decades. And so this was the game of why Mosul fell. It was a U.S. Kurdish operation. And again, it was U.S. weapons that ISIS used to take over Mosul. There was this important study by a UK-based group called Conflict Armament Research, which went to all these places where ISIS fought battles against the Iraqi forces, et cetera, and they documented the weapons that they were captured from ISIS and followed the chain back. And all of these weapons, again, were literally purchased by the U.S. military in Eastern Europe and transferred through on Saudi and Azerbaijani flights. There was Silk Airways from Azerbaijan, an airline owned by Aliyev, the president, who's a big Israeli asset. They were, had all these cargo flights sending these weapons again to Jordan, and then from the CIA operations room in Jordan, they'd send them across the border to ISIS. ISIS also, when they took over large parts of Iraq, they had Cornet anti-tank missiles that were provided to them by Masoud Barzani's Kurds. The Kurds had purchased them from Bulgaria in previous years. And so when ISIS was taking over Fallujah and Ramadi and threatening Baghdad in the months before they took over Mosul, they destroyed a bunch of U.S. tanks that the Iraqi army was using, these Abrams tanks. ISIS was using these Cornet anti-tank missiles received from, a U.S. ally, the Kurds, to then destroy Iraqi army tanks that had been provided by the U.S. So anyways, this was all a big U.S. Operation. And then the final thing to mention is that once Mosul fell, the next part of the puzzle for the Kurds to create their own independent state, now that they had Kirkuk and this oil, which they immediately began exporting via Turkey to Israel, by the way. Once the Kurds had control of Kirkuk, the final thing was to take over this territory in western Iraq called Sinjar, which was home to the Yazidi religious minority. Because if the Kurds could take over Sinjar, that would allow them to have their own autonomous or potentially independent Kurdish state that would stretch from Iran in the east all the way through Sulaymaniyah and then Erbil and then essentially north of Mosul and then into Sinjar that would actually reach the Syrian border. And then they could hook up with the Kurds on the Syrian side, the Rojava project, which was, U.S. backed, right? And this would give the Kurds this huge contiguous territory stretching all the way into Syria. And they even they wanted to potentially conquer all of northern Syria and have that being a Kurdish autonomous region or state in northern Syria that would stretch all the way to the Syrian coast. So the Kurds could potentially control territory from Iran on the one side to the Syrian coast on the other. But what was standing in the way was these Yazidis who were in Sinjar, right in this strategic territory. And so then Barzani basically came up with this plan. They said, look, we're gonna claim that we're protecting the Yazidis. Our Peshmerga is actually in Sinjar and controls it. But we've got all these people that we want to get rid of, just like the Israelis want to get rid of, Palestinians in Gaza so they can annex it and build Jewish settlements there. The Kurds wanted to get rid of the Yazidis that were in Sinjar, take over, ethnically cleanse it, take over the territory, make it Kurdish, and create their Kurdish state. So the Peshmerga, which were defending Sinjar and the Yazidis, they claimed on the night of August 3rd of 2014, ISIS initiated an attack on Sinjar from like three sides, basically, in the Peshmerga in an organized, controlled, deliberate way, withdrew without telling or warning anyone and allowed ISIS to come into these Yazidi villages and massacre several thousand Yazidi men and take thousands of Yazidi women and children as slaves. And the women and the young girls, of course, became sex slaves. So this was all basically planned by Masoud Barzani using ISIS as a proxy, just like the Israelis in Sabra and Shatila camp. In a more famous example, in Lebanon in 1982, the Israelis had surrounded the Palestinian camps in Sabra and Shatila in the suburbs of Beirut, and General Ariel Sharon, or Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, who was in charge of the whole operation, allowed these Christian militias to enter the Palestinian camps and massacre
and slaughter them.
Again, they used the Christian militias as proxies, but it was the Israelis who orchestrated it, controlled the camp, let the militias in. Masoud Barzani and the Kurds did that exact same thing to the Yazidis. And so to this day, everyone knows that a genocide occurred in Sinjar. They know that ISIS did that. And it's gotten recognition as a genocide from the UN and all these different people. But almost no one outside of Yazidis themselves, almost no one knows that Masoud Barzani and the Kurdish Peshmerga actually orchestrated the genocide of Yazidis. And they also orchestrated the fall of Mosul to ISIS a few months before. I hope they will explain that clearly. And again, sorry for the long rant, but
you're good. No, you're good, man. Because I read your article about it. And I was meaning to ask you about this. One thing, as well as when it comes to the West support for ISIS, when Nusra took over the oil in Syria near Turkey, and the EU lifted the embargo on Syria to fund these guys and buy the oil from them as a way to get money to them, and they masqueraded that this was the FSA, but if you read the article, I think it's from the Financial Times, I think, where they're describing, you talk about this in your book, they're describing it, and it's like, no, this is Al-Qaeda, and eventually turned into ISIS. So the EU deliberately lifted the embargo on Syria to buy oil from them as a way to giving them funds, as a way of like supporting the revolution or whatever, but it was just Al-Qaeda, and eventually turned into ISIS. And the same thing happened in Raqqa, where the West supported the FSA taking over Raqqa, but it was really Nusra. And then Nusra, a lot of the guys defected to ISIS because the split happened over oil revenue. You know, they tried to make that about it was an ideological difference or whatever, and that's like a justification they used to support Jelani because he broke with ISIS or whatever. No, it was they were arguing about money, specifically revenue from oil. Baghdadi wanted it, Jelani wanted it, and that's what caused the split. But Raqqa turned into basically the capital of ISIS in Syria, and the West supported that. And some of the most brutal treatment of people during the war happened in Raqqa, which was captured by the FSA and allied with Nusra. And then Nusra turned it, a lot of the, just basically all those people defected to ISIS. And then ISIS, you know, took control of Raqqa.
Yeah, and here's another important thing to mention is that, like I said, it was part of the U.S. and the Kurdish plan to allow ISIS to take over a bunch of these territories, not just in Iraq, but also in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the policy shifted, the idea was then, okay, ISIS takes over this territory, but when the time is appropriate, then we have the Kurds go in and liberate the territory. And then guess who gets to keep the territory?
Kurds.
The Kurds. You don't give it back to the Yazidis. You don't give it back to the Arabs in northeast Syria, in Deir ez-Zor. You give it to the Kurds. And so in several instances where ISIS was present in important towns and cities, and then U.S. and Kurdish forces came to fight ISIS and liberate these areas from ISIS, in fact, there was no real fighting. The U.S. would bomb the place, but the ISIS militants would just withdraw.
Right.
And just give up the territory to the Kurds, whether the Iraqi Kurds, the Peshmerga on the Iraqi side, or to the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is really the YPG or the PKK on the Syrian side. So, for example, in Sinjar city, when the Kurdish Peshmerga went to liberate Sinjar city in December 2015, there was no fight. They took over the city in like one day, and there was a German journalist who was embedded with the Peshmerga. He said he saw one dead ISIS fighter.
Mm.
Then in Shadadi, another city, Shadadi, which is just across the border from Sinjar, which is a major ISIS stronghold near the Syrian-Iraqi border, it was the same. When the SDF went to take it over, the Syrian or the ISIS fighters just withdrew. They just withdrew and they just left it, a really important strategic town. And then the exact same thing happened in Raqqa. Supposedly there was this huge battle in Raqqa, and in fact, Raqqa was heavily destroyed by U.S. bombing. But there's reporting from the BBC and Reuters, which talks about how all of the ISIS fighters, thousands and thousands of ISIS fighters and their weapons were just allowed as part of a deal to leave the city. Mm. And there was a Syrian, an SDF spokesperson who later came out and told Reuters that the whole battle to liberate Raqqa, it was just theater. It wasn't even real. They bombed it. The U.S. bombed it from the air, but they didn't actually try to kill the ISIS fighters. They just let them evacuate with all their weapons in these huge convoys of buses. And again, there's BBC and Reuters reports about this. And in fact, the ISIS fighters that were allowed to evacuate Raqqa, they were sent to Deir ez-Zor, which was still under ISIS control, because that is where the Syrian army was trying to.
Yes.
So they evacuated ISIS fighters from Raqqa, let the Kurds take it over, even though it's an Arab city, and they sent all the ISIS guys to Deir ez-Zor so they could fight the Syrian army.
Mm.
So that was the game, was to have ISIS take over the territory first, pump up ISIS in the propaganda as if they're a big evil terrorist organization, which of course they were, but promote that and make sure everyone knows it. But then have the Kurds come in and then have ISIS just give up the territory to them. And then the Kurds can act like they legitimately deserve the territory. Or of course they have public support because they were the ones that fought ISIS. How can you oppose the Kurds that fought ISIS? This is just like a big game.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And so the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS was basically just kayfabe almost basically, and that the real fighters of ISIS was Syria, Hezbollah, Russia, and Iran.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And there's even a reports in a outlet called the Free Beacon, where they quoted a bunch of U.S. officials and generals who said that the Obama administration, was refusing to bomb ISIS training camps throughout that whole period.
Mm-hmm.
There
And you
was like
have
50 ISIS training camps, which would be the perfect place to bomb, because if you bomb ISIS in the middle of a city like Raqqa, of course,
you'll kill civilians.
or in Mosul, where there was a real battle, you do see all these civilians getting killed. But if you're bombing an ISIS training camp, you're just killing ISIS. And there are these literally U.S. officials and generals speaking to this outlet saying, we're getting pissed off because we want to bomb these ISIS training camps, and Obama won't let us do it.
Yeah, and you definitely have Israeli policymakers talking about how not destroying ISIS was in Israel's national security interest because they were fighting the Shia, they were fighting Hezbollah in Syria and Iran. And I mean, you look at the guys who were assassinated. I mean, the chief one that comes to mind is General Soleimani, that was killed by Trump in 2020. I mean, what this guy was doing for the most part was killing these ISIS guys and these Al Qaeda guys. That's what he was doing, and they assassinate him. And you go and you look through what he did. I mean, shit. Soleimani was even in Afghanistan fighting against the Taliban when that first broke out alongside the United States in the 2000s. And but Israel was certainly very open about the fact that ISIS served their national security interests, and destroying it would be counterproductive.
Yeah, there's Israeli intelligence people, generals, think tank people that acknowledge that
they were almost bragging about it.
Almost bragging, yeah. I will say in Afghanistan, the Iranians actually helped the U.S. in Afghanistan.
Yeah, they did. Yeah,
right after 2001, and they even did so in Iraq in the earliest years in Iraq, because they also wanted to get rid of Saddam. So there is some collaboration between the Iranians and the U.S. in Afghanistan and Iraq in that period, which is kind of a dirty history, in my opinion, on the Iranians' part. But
well, after
Soleimani was fighting ISIS, and yeah, Trump decided to kill the main guy fighting ISIS. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And after 2001, after 9/11 happened, I mean, everyone's seen the video, or people in the know have seen the video. You know, Iran they're lighting these candles and having a memorial and saying how evil this was. The death happened to the United States because these were people they had to deal with. And same thing happened in Russia. You know, Russia had fought the terrorists in Chechnya. And so there was this attempt by people who had been pushed away by the United States, be like, listen, this is our enemies too. You know, we also fight against these radical Sunni terrorists, Wahhabist types. And America still ruined that situation. You know, you had these people reach out to fight with us, and we kind of did for a little bit. And then you have the Axis of Evil speech in 2002, which very much soured Iran. But then they collaborated a little bit in Iraq. You know, what's interesting, speaking of that, is we're talking about Syria. One of the most nonsensical things that was said about Bashar al-Assad is that he actually supported al-Qaeda. And that's why he let all these people out of prison, was to sabotage the protests that were happening. Is it was him that was behind the Islamification of it, because Assad had let all these prisoners out and he was backing al-Qaeda. Just the opposite is true. They even claimed that in 2003 he was letting al-Qaeda guys roll into Iraq. Now that might be a little bit more credible, but this idea that Assad was opening up the prisons during 2011 and allowing all these people to join the protests, that was just absolutely nonsensical. But that was something that opposition people were really, really pushing.
Yeah, regarding the prison issue in Syria, there were some guys that did get released from Sednaya, or there's like, for example, there's like one case.
But the protesters were demanding those people be released, though.
Demanding it, and the biggest example of that was the leader of the armed group Jaish al-Islam, a guy named Zahran al-Lush, who came from a prominent family in Ghouta. And yeah, the protesters were demanding that he be released. And so to kind of calm the street, Assad let some of these guys out of prison. but he wasn't the one giving them billions of dollars and weapons and anti-tank missiles. And it's like, okay,
Well,
well,
see,
who?
he tried that. They did the same thing. This is why the Arab Spring coming to Syria made no sense, right? Because most of the Arab Spring was against these old dictators that were tyrannical, and most of them were American allies in Tunisia and in Egypt. And even in Libya, Gaddafi made attempts to cooperate with the West, and they told him no. But Syria was different because his father had died. He had taken the presidency. He was a young guy, especially for like the region. He was like in his 40s, I think, in 2011 when this stuff broke out, and he was 34 when he took power. And he was a reformer. He was like the reformer. You had like the Damascus Spring stuff, and but around 2005, I think was when this happened. When this or this no 2008 when the Sidr revolution happened in Lebanon, and they blamed Syria for killing the president. And that's what led to Syria leaving Lebanon and ending their occupation there. That's kind of what caused the shift of opinion amongst Assad in the region. But for the most part, he was still a popular guy, and he was not this brutal tyrant, at least compared to the other guys. He really wasn't. He was a young guy, and it just didn't make that much sense for the Arab Spring to break out there.
Yeah, I mean, Syria before 2011, it was a good place. I mean, it was a police state. If you criticize the government or the president, you'd get in trouble. But that's the case everywhere. Go to Egypt and say anything about Sisi, you'll
look what happened to Bahrain when the protests broke out, and Saudi Arabia immediately got there and shut all that shit down.
Yeah, in Saudi Arabia, they'll cut your head off, like they did to the Shia cleric Nimr. But even today, or go to Jordan. If you go to Jordan, I've actually did this like naively. When I was studying Arabic there in 2015, in my Arabic class, I started talking about how the king of Jordan, I think it was King Hussein, he did a deal with the Israelis to basically, okay, I'll take the West Bank in 1947 if I let you guys take, these other areas. He basically did a deal with the Israelis. I started talking about that in this Arabic class, and the instructor, it looked like she had seen a ghost. I mean, she was just terrified that I was talking about this stuff. And then I later realized that if you talk about the king in Jordan, you'll be locked away in a heartbeat for a really long time. Again, same thing in Egypt, same thing in Kurdistan, in Masoud Barzani's Kurdistan. You do not talk about these people or they will kill you. So in Syria, you couldn't talk about Assad, but it was basically a good country. The population of Syria was not that big, and they had, for the resources that they had plenty of oil. They're not like a major oil producer, but they had enough, for their own population by far. They produced plenty of food, plenty of wheat, both in northeast Syria, and then a lot of produce on the coast in the Alawite areas and the coastal regions. People, made good salaries. They could go to university for free. They got free healthcare. It was a very safe place. You could stay out and walk the streets at 3, 4 in the morning. You could drive from one side of the country to the other with no checkpoints, nothing.
I mean, what I was going to point out when it comes to like the freedoms, Syria had freedoms that we take for granted that other countries just don't have. Like you could drink alcohol, you had religious freedom because of how much of a pluralistic society that it was. So you could free to be the religion that you wanted. There was no forcing of anything of the Muslim religion onto people. There was none of that, and that's something that at the West, it's like, well, obviously, but in other Arab countries, that's not how it is. You don't get the type of social and even, legal freedom to practice whatever religion that you want to. But you did have that in Syria. And as well as something else which made Syria so popular before 2011, it was basically the only Arab state that actually stood up to Israel.
Yeah, and so that was a big source of Assad's popularity. And so it was a stable, good society, especially by the standards of the region, but they were standing against Israel. And so that was the reason that the U.S. and Israel made the decision to, again, use these sectarian extremist groups to try to spark a civil war. and try to get Sunnis to be angry against the government and kill Alawites, and Alawites to kill Sunnis. And as the war went on, like in any war, the Syrian government also did many bad things.
Mm-hmm.
Russians killed a lot of people when they were bombing in the fight against ISIS and Nusra. And then also the corruption got really bad on the Syrian government side as well. Like the rebels and the Al Qaeda people were kidnapping a lot of people for ransom or just killing them. But even on the government side, they were kidnapping a lot of people. It became like a business. You'd be, if you were a Sunni,
Organ trafficking became very popular as well in Syria in the later years. You talk about that in your book.
Yeah, there's a lot of organ trafficking. It seemed to be on both sides. It's better documented on the Al Qaeda side for sure. That's like very very well documented. But I think it probably happened on the government.
I think Assad
business,
not organ trafficking, but drug trafficking became kind of a thing amongst the Syrian government. Now I don't know how prominent that was, but there was always talks about how they were involved in narcotic trafficking at the later years of the war. But that shit's caused by the West because they have no way of making money, because basically the most strict sanction regime that has ever been seen was put onto Syria. They had no other way of making money, and their oil had been taken over. So like, what are they? It's like in Cuba when the women turned to prostitution. It's like, well, how do you expect? That's kind of just what happens.
Yeah. So that's the problem is, like, once you start a war, like when you start, point A, or your starting point, is a stable functioning society, and then you deliberately destroy that and disrupt it and create huge amounts of violence, everything just goes to shit. Like whether it's the infrastructure, like civilizations and societies are very fragile. In the US, we don't know that really, or it's hard to understand that because we haven't had a war on our soil, who knows when? Civil War, I don't know.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is like, think of the South after the Civil War. That really did fuck the South up, But
Americans, we have no experience of that, right? And we can't really imagine that one day there just like wouldn't be electricity, or that one day like suddenly the currency will just collapse, and if you have $100,000 in the bank, suddenly it's worth like 5,000. Like no one has experience that, but in wars, that's what happens, and that's what happened in Syria. And so both on both sides of any war, you get people that commit war crimes, that the hatred gets really bad, and you get massacres and all these things, and you get corruption, and you get theft, and you get extortion. So that did happen on those type of things did happen on the government side too. But the problem from my perspective is that why did the Israelis and the Americans start this and create a war where it's inevitable that these terrible things would happen, because they do in all wars. It's like in Iraq, for example, like if you try to say, look what happened in Iraq during the height of the sectarian war. Even when I was there in 2005, it was like, man, the Sunnis were doing some terrible shit to the Shia. But man, the Shia were doing some terrible shit.
Yeah.
Sunnis.
What was really effed up about Syria was because of how much the propaganda was. You were led to believe, around 2013 to 2014, people really couldn't do this facade anymore about these nice, innocent, moderate rebels, because you have the rise of ISIS and al-Nusra. But even before that, what made it so more fucked up was because you couldn't talk about it. I'm sure you experienced this as well when you started actually writing about it, which is that if you said like, hey man, these chemical weapons are like fake probably, or even that like you talk about this in the end of your book, the Caesar pictures, the 55,000 pictures that were taken, and ended up half of them were Syrian army guys and half of the other half were like just pictures taken in a morgue. But they were leading people to believe, and this was used amongst the United States to tighten sanctions in like 2019. They were leading people to believe that every single one of these pictures were pictures of torture victims in Assad's prisons. And the opposite of that was true. The minority of the pictures were that. Most of them were either dead Syrian army guys or people who had died in the morgue who were probably died in battle. So, like if you called out that propaganda, you'd be called a Assadist. You'd say you're denying human rights violations, etc. But what was actually happening here was just there was propaganda being made to increase the support for America and Israel's and the Gulf states and Turkey's dirty war on Syria.
Yeah, so with the Caesar photos, again, like I said, it's probably like half and half, but you don't know. Like it's hard to know. Like there's some Syrians who say they've identified their relatives in the pictures, and they were people that were arrested by the government and disappeared. So there's definitely some of that. But then, like you said, for probably half of the pictures, even it was acknowledged by Human Rights Watch, but in like this really like subtle way, so you wouldn't really like pay attention. But yeah, half the pictures were the opposite of what they claimed, which is they were victims of the righteous rebels. So have half the people were killed by the government and half the people were killed by the rebels. Is that a reason to now impose like crushing economic sanctions on the country, which just totally made the Syrian currency collapse and just put an entire country into poverty for years and years and years? It was, part of an intelligence operation that had this really sinister objective, which was to use people's deaths, whether they were killed by the government or whether they were killed by the rebels, to inflict additional suffering on all of Syria. And it's just really fucked up. And so, yeah, there are all these activists who were bragging or pushing, like Syrians themselves, who were pushing for the Caesar sanctions to be put on to Syria. And it's just really was just really perverse. But yeah, like you said, you couldn't even give like a balanced picture. Even even trying to give a balanced picture was not acceptable. It had to be 100% pro Al-Qaeda propaganda, and anything else was, just like the Israelis. You know what I mean? They're even like the Israelis. They're literally people like like European politicians who are like supportive of the Israelis, but they don't support. They support them 98%, and the Israelis get angry and
At the
freak out.
2%.
They're not supporting him 100%. They're only supporting him 98%, and it was that same sanity. And again, there was so much propaganda because the opposition side had Al Jazeera with it, not to mention CNN, not to mention the BBC, not to mention the New York Times and all these other things. But having Al Jazeera on their side, it was just creating like constant fake news, fake massacres, like rebels, killing people, filming it and blaming it on the government. There was just so much like, black propaganda going on that
Right.
trying to call that out to even have like a balanced picture was you would get criticized very strongly. Yeah.
What was even worse was and this was kind of my buddy made this comparison, was that in the West you had Syrian opposition leaders and advocating for their own country to be bombed and advocating for increasing support for Al-Qaeda. And it kind of reminded me of like the Iranian monarchists and the Pavlias, like advocating for their own country to be bombed and advocating for, arming. There really isn't an Iranian opposition, actually, especially since January, but arming someone and doing this and that. And I can't imagine actually the kind of despicable person you have to be to like advocating for like your own people to be bombed and destroyed, specifically by the United States and Israel, two of the most corrupt and evil regimes that exist. Although there's some close competitors when it comes to the Gulf, but that kind of reminded me of that. And I can't imagine being like a journalist like during the height of the Syrian civil war, or around like 2000, from 2012 to 2018 or 2019, and like covering it like you were, and like you had to get some personal. Like, did anyone ever threaten you or anything like that, or did anything serious ever come about that, man? Because I know if I even post about Jelani, I'll have people come at me and talk about how evil Assad was and how righteous Jelani is, and they get very personal with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, just like on Twitter, that's all. I just get attacked on Twitter, and so that's not a big deal at the end of the day. But there are other people that did get like threatened. Even Joshua Landis, the academic from the University of Oklahoma, who actually advises the U.S. government, even advises the CIA. When he at times would report things that went against the narrative. Like he was one of the people who said early on, for example, there was this case in the city of Banyas.
Mm-hmm.
And you might remember this because, of course, I talk about it in the book, where there was a bus full of soldiers and
Yeah.
they were coming to the city, and some snipers on the opposition side opened fire from a bridge and killed like 8, if I remember, or maybe 12 Syrian soldiers. And the opposition people came and claimed, oh, these were killed by their own fellow soldiers because they were going to defect. And anyways, so Joshua Landis exposed that and said, no, that's not what happened. Like, they were killed by snipers from the opposition side. And he got a lot of threats and he got attacked a lot. So I didn't have to go through anything like that, of course, but you would just get criticized online. And there was a lot of gaslighting. There were these people who were being paid to promote this propaganda, and they would speak with such surety as if they knew the truth, and they would just go around attacking anyone who was like, I may not be an expert, but this doesn't make sense. Like, how could it be that this or that or that, the story doesn't match up? They would just go on the attack and say, no, like, this is what's happening, and I know, and you don't know, blah, blah, blah. So they really did a good job, not that I'm praising this, but an effective job of like keeping any
very successful propaganda.
People that were thinking that, hey, maybe the mainstream story isn't the right one. They did a really effective job of just like making those people doubt themselves and think, oh, well, they must know better than me,
Right.
These are people that were just being paid. So I'm trying to think of like a similar equivalent.
Well, I know.
One of the first wars that really played out like fully online with social media and stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of a new thing.
Well, I'll tell you what it reminds me of, the propaganda revolving Syria, was the propaganda revolving the Russia-Ukraine war. That was also very propagandized and getting people to support Ukraine when Ukraine was doing a bunch of really bad stuff. And it's not to say Russia wasn't as well, but I mean, you think about some of the stuff. I mean, you had try to gaslight everyone and say the Azov Battalion weren't Nazis, and even though they'd been on an arms embargo before being Nazis, and then you had to pretend that they weren't, and other thing, pretend that NATO never promised Gorbachev not to expand eastward. You had to pretend that didn't happen. You had to pretend NATO was strictly defensive and that there was no reason for Russia to go in, and just tons of propaganda. And I think one reason why a lot of just people who supported the revolution, a lot of them are Muslims who live in Europe. One reason why they get so defensive about it, especially now, is they just fell for it. This is one of those times where, you just think about what these people thought they were supporting. They thought they were supporting a revolution against a tyrant, and it was very religious based, and they knew that, and they were supporting it. And then this guy actually gets in power. The tyrant actually falls, and you get a guy who's more authoritarian, more brutal, and now you don't get the anti-Zionism that you got with Assad. And a lot of people who supported the Syrian revolution, think of the Al Jazeera guys, they're kind of like pro-Palestine, right? And now even the pro-Palestinian stuff that happened under Assad, now you get the opposite. Now you get normalization of Israel and the demilitarization of armed Palestinian groups that existed in Syria.
Yeah, and regarding the Ukraine thing, the attitude of the Ukraine activists online in terms of enforcing this ideological, yes. Their behavior was very similar to the Syrian activists. But regarding the people in the diaspora, yeah, some of the Muslims, again, if you're living in Europe, one of the problems is you're affected by the propaganda too, because you're getting from Al Jazeera. So if you're a Syrian exile living in Paris or Berlin or London, you're seeing the propaganda too. So it affects people. It's very convincing. Again, in the case of Syria, it was extremely sophisticated. So I could see how people were misled. Again, I was tricked by the propaganda for a couple of years. I was never like a huge pro-opposition guy like Max Blumenthal, for example. He
Yeah,
was
he
like,
quit his job, didn't he, because of the Syria stuff? Because he was pro-revolution, and the guys he was working with were pro-Assad, and then he admitted that he was wrong, and he wrote a really good book about that. And yeah, a lot of people fell for it.
but he was like extremely vocal pro-opposition,
Mm-hmm.
and even attacked a very good journalist, Sharmeen Narwani, who was also working at Al Akhbar, a Lebanese
Yes.
newspaper at the time, and he really attacked her in a terrible way before he changed his position. But again, the propaganda was so sophisticated that even though I never was like gung ho like that, and never wrote anything in support of the so-called revolution, I can understand why people were kind of tricked by it. I don't know if you want to, I know we've been going a really long
Yeah,
time.
I was gonna say we can wrap it up here soon. Do you were you gonna say something else or
Well, I was just gonna say the final thing about the Russia Ukraine stuff,
yeah, let me
because
hear it.
um, you know, this is an interesting one where my views have changed a little bit too. Like I said, I was aware of you know, the Maidan false flag snipers, for example, in 2014, and the Ukrainian war on ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass starting from 2014, and all the arguments you mentioned about, you know, NATO expansion and the CIA,
Mm-hmm.
you know, supporting Azov and trying to persecute Russian speakers in the East. And also, there was a lot of the propaganda around the Bucha massacre. That's a very interesting case because the Russians definitely killed some civilians in Bucha, and you know, just alleged massacre at the very beginning of the war. But most of the people were probably killed by Ukrainian artillery. The Ukrainian army just was bombing Bucha with artillery to prevent the Russians from approaching closer to Kyiv. But then after they took control of the Bucha, which is in the Kyiv suburbs, they went and filmed all the bodies and said, "Look, the Russians
Yeah,
massacred all
yeah, I
these."
remember this. Yeah.
And it was a big psyop, and that was used as the reason to like, "Yo, we can't negotiate with Russia, and we can't end the war after just a couple of weeks. Like, we can never, you know, compromise these people." And Boris Johnson showed up and told, he
Yes,
told
yes, the famous peace
Zelensky,
conference in Istanbul. Yes.
you can't have peace with Russia. Look, they just massacred all these people in Bucha. So Bucha was like a big psyop. So in the initial days of the war, I was definitely on more of the pro-Russian side. But like also in the meantime, I've kind of realized, I guess you would say maybe the Jewish angle to it, which is the Azov battalions, like they're getting funded by this Jewish
Kolomitsky.
Ukrainian oligarch Kolomoisky.
Kolomolsky.
Or I'm probably, you're probably saying it right.
I might be saying we're telling the same guy, Kolo. Yeah.
So like, okay, well, you got these, and then all Zelensky and all of his top advisors, they're mostly Jewish. Like recently, there were some anti-corruption raids where two of his top advisors had to flee Kyiv, and you know they had like golden toilets in their villas, and you know looted billions of dollars from the defense ministry or the national oil company, I forget which. But all of a sudden, you know, they escape getting arrested, and you see footage of them on the beach in Tel Aviv, you know, hanging out. Like, okay, well, that's kind of weird. There's this heavy Jewish influence on the Ukrainian side, but they're supporting neo-Nazis. Okay, that's a little weird. And then on the Putin side, you know, in more recently, I've learned more about things in Russia. Where in the Russian side, the Chabad Lubavitch, the Jewish religious group, activist group that has their headquarters in Brooklyn, where Rebbe Schneerson is buried, and where Jared Kushner and Donald Trump and Netanyahu and every other American politician, they go and they visit the Rebbe's grave. There's the Chabad Lubavitch. They're the top rabbi in Russia is Chabad Lubavitch. That's close with Putin. And the Chabad people openly brag that they run Russia, and that the Jews control Russia basically, and that Putin works for them. So you're like, okay, well, what the fuck is going on in the Ukraine and Russia war? Where I thought Russia, if you listen to Douglas McGregor or Jeffrey Sachs or Scott Ritter, it was like Russia was supposed to win the war, like in 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and they still haven't, and all they're doing is just killing Ukrainian soldiers. So you've got Orthodox Christian Russian or Ukrainians on the one side, Orthodox Christian Russian soldiers on the other, dying in these trenches or getting tracked down by these drones. And then on both sides, you have Jewish oligarchs running the show. It's like, what the fuck is going on there? You know what I mean? So I don't know. My views on the Russia stuff, I'm not even sure what to make of it sometimes. But it's evolved a little bit from I guess the early days when I was more like in the Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter camp, and now I'm like, I don't know. There's some weird shit going on both sides, you know.
I've looked into this quite deeply.
So yeah,
and
what's
I
your
would
opinion before we go? Yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, sure. I would say I think it is true. First of all, the Ukraine government, you were definitely correct there. It's very, very Jewish. And there's reports in the electronic intifada that Israel itself was covertly giving weapons to Azov during the civil war before the SMO started. And I would say that I think a lot, and also more Jewish angle stuff. Think of like Victoria Nuland, right? Orchestrating the coup in Maidan. And I think a big reason why that happened was because of Russia's support for Syria. That I kind of actually, there's an article written by Victoria Nuland in Foreign Affairs. It's the only article she ever written. And she talked about a reason why America gave support for Maidan, and the reason why they don't like Russia is because of their support for the evil tyrant Bashar al-Assad. And but when it comes to on the Russia side, it is true there's a lot of Jewish oligarchs there. But a lot of that is just reminiscence of the Yeltsin years and the post-Soviet Union years when the creation of the oligarch class. If you remember, a big thing that Putin did, one of the first things he did when he came into power, was the nationalization of oil, which was ran by a Jewish oligarch, and he had to go into exile. And then there's this big media corporation that was also run by a Jewish guy, and that was nationalized, and he, I think, was thrown in prison. And so there's always been a skepticism of Jews, of Putin. But it's also important to remember that Putin has very close ties to Netanyahu as well. And but I think a lot of that got messed up during the Syria stuff, and now certainly with Iran. You know, Russia's been a key player in helping Iran get around the sanctions with trade through the Caspian Sea. Russia, literally a few days before the war started, promised hundreds of missiles and hundreds of interceptors to Iran. So I think Ukraine, I think it's much more simple. That was a coup orchestrated by Jews in the West and also Jews in the East. Kolomoisky had a big deal to do with that, and then eventually get Zelensky and all these other guys. Russia, it's complicated because I think Putin is stuck in a situation to where on one side he wants to do what's best for Russians, and on the other side he wants to placate these oligarchs who are Jewish, and all of them have financial ties to the West. And I think that's also what took so long for him to do the SMO in 2022, because he knew once that was going to happen, they were going to get hit brutally with sanctions. And a lot of the oligarch class was against the SMO because a lot of their assets got frozen. And there was a lot of Jews that fled Russia and also fled Ukraine once the SMO started. So I think I definitely side with Putin more. I do have my criticisms, one being that he trades a lot with Israel, one being that I think he's too soft. I think he should have fully annexed Ukraine in 2014 and just went into Kiev then, instead of having this weird proxy thing in the Donbass and then deciding in 2022 he was going to go in. But I think a lot of that is just because, you know, Putin, he gets made out in the media to be almost this kind of fascistic figure, but he's not. He's actually the descendant of what would be the liberals in Russia with, he was Yeltsin's guy, and Yeltsin was the West's guy. And the West even rigged an election in 1997 to ensure that Yeltsin stayed in power. And then he got sick and Putin came in. So I think Putin is more of this guy who's still trying to figure out what exactly his role is and Russia's role is. And that's why he's so slow to act. That is why the Ukraine war has gone on for so long. I don't really think the Ukraine war was started as a regime change operation that was supposed to last 3 days. I think that was bluff. I think it was supposed to be this show of power to get another deal signed and more forced. Because just look at how big the army was going into Ukraine in the start of the SMO, it was like 190,000 people. That's not enough to take Kiev. Think how many people like Mearsheimer brings this up when he talks about it. Think how many soldiers the Nazis got together to go into Poland. But and Nazi Germany had a much better military, at least in comparison, for the time than Russia. And so I think a lot of the Jewish influence in Russia, I know a lot of people talk about it. I think it's a little over exaggerated. One reason because of how much wealth is owned by the government, because of how much wealth is in oil, and then how much wealth is owned by the government. Putin showed that he is willing to put the boot down when it comes to a lot of these oligarchs. That happened a lot in literally his first year. But yeah, Putin's it's a really tricky situation because, like you talk about, you have Jews funding Nazis, and then you have Putin and these other oligarchs, Jewish oligarchs, supporting him. But then the West, which is obviously controlled by Zionists, supporting Ukraine. So it leaves you in a tough situation. But what I would say is I think a lot of the oligarchs are simply reminiscence of a previous administration with the creation of the oligarch class. And Putin has done things kind of against this class. And I think the SMO is like the ultimate act against them because a lot of them were against it. It really hurt them economically. And I think strengthening ties with stuff like Iran also kind of furthers that he's not solely in this camp that like America is, if that makes sense. I think that's my full position on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That maybe he's trying to shadow both worlds. But so I guess I would, the final thing that like I guess I get annoyed. I appreciate your view on it because it's nuanced. So what I get annoyed about is when people are like, Russia is like with the resistance, or Russia is like with Palestine, or Russia is with 100% with Iran, when like Lavrov, just recently came out and said that like, well, we're committed to Israel's security. And even Putin, after the 12-day war in Iran a year ago.
Yeah, all the Russian speakers in Israel. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was this idea, maybe it wasn't like valid to begin with, but there was this idea that, Iran and Russia, they got these military ties, they never signed a proper, mutual defense pact or anything. But there was kind of this idea that like, well, if Israel ever goes to war against Iran, like Russia's going to like have their back 100%. And then after the 12-day war, Putin's just like, nah, like Israel's basically a Russian-speaking country. What do you want from me? And that's the thing is too, regarding some things in Syria. I had to kind of reevaluate some of my views about Russia and Syria because, like I said, they facilitated Assad giving up the chemical weapons. And at the time, I kind of thought, well, it was just a way to avoid the Western intervention. It was such a win for the Israelis that later I kind of thought, man, I don't know, maybe Lavrov was doing Netanyahu a favor there. And then later on, for example, Syria had S-300 missile air defense systems. And I know for sure that the Russians refused to let the Syrians use their S-300s against Israeli jets. So the Russians and the Israelis had an agreement where Israel.
They had an agreement Israel wouldn't hit their stuff and Syria wouldn't hit their stuff. Yeah.
And, so it's like so Putin is not like the pro-resistance ally that he often gets made out to be. So your position is much more nuanced.
I see China in a similar way as well. China, basically almost all of Iran's oil exports went to China. It was like 80%. China was heavily helping out Iran's economy. They're obviously trying to compete with the West when it comes to Africa. I think the regime change in Argentina with Milei coming in, I think that was mostly election fraud, and they got him to come in. And the first thing he does is get out of BRICS. Similar things are happening in Venezuela. You should look into the Isaac Accords if you've heard of that before. Maybe you have and you're familiar, but there's really, really weird stuff going on in South America, and it involves Israel as well. And most of that is to combat Russia but more specifically China's influence. But as well, Israel's a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. China still does deals with China. China still does deals with China. China still does deals with Israel. Most of the American fear-mongering about Taiwan is just that. It's fear-mongering. China doesn't really have any serious plans to militarily occupy Taiwan. So they're also one of these kind of actors that are portrayed as bringing about the multipolar order and fighting against the American Israeli hegemony, but they want to be a part of it. That's what most of this stuff is that Russia and China want to be a part of it, but they've been told no because they're still realist actors, I think, focused on their own country's interests. And so, China was a part of the DTUB. It still is, but it was brought in 2001 as the WTO. And they were buying up treasury bonds and stuff. And then there's this pivot towards Asia that happened. And you have an increase in militarization of South Korea. So China and Russia are these countries that have reformed, especially China with the reform and opening up under Deng and this kind of abandoning of the communist line. And Russia is also this non-revolutionary state. But I think these are countries that are just looking after their own interests, which means sometimes collaborating with Israel and then sometimes collaborating with Iran, for example. And so, but the key difference there is that these countries, like it is China, and China, Xi, and in Russia, it's Putin. These are countries that determine their own country's decisions, where in the United States, it is at the end of the day a foreign country that is deciding its decision. So that's what my opinions on these countries are. I think they're still forces of good, but they're not these actors that are committed to really anything else besides self-interest.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I don't know, again, maybe for another time, there's the whole.
Maybe we can talk about this again. There's some stuff I can send you if you're more interested.
Yeah, or even like kind of some stuff having to do with COVID. But anyways, that's a huge topic.
Oh, COVID. I never got too big into the COVID stuff. I was, I know some people have their opinions on it. I never got really into the.
But that actually, there's some things about it that also made me kind of reevaluate some views on geopolitics and how states are relating to each other. But at any rate, that's a whole nother thing. So,
well, thanks for coming on, man. I'm glad I got to talk about this, not just talk about Syria, but Iran, and then discuss some stuff about Russia and China, because I'm known in the spheres that I operate in as like this big pro Russia and China guy, and I am to a certain degree, but I'll criticize them when I find issues with them. But I'm an American. I live in the United States, and my enemy is the Zionist-occupied American government. It's not really, I can't do anything over there in Russia, but I can have an influence in the, in the country I live in. So that's my position on that. Did you lag out there, or? Seems you, all right, we had a little technical difficulties right there at the end. I'm glad that didn't happen anywhere else in the interview, but man, this went for a long time and I really enjoyed it. So just to signal off, do you have anything that you'd like to promote or anything that you would like to, where can people find your work at, etc.? Oh, it seems that you've lagged out. It's lagged again. What huh. All right, there we go. Okay, sorry for the technical difficulties, but glad that did not happen at all during like the actual interview. But just to signal off, thanks for coming on, and where can people find your work at?
Oh yeah, so again, if you'd like to purchase my book on Syria, it's called Creative Chaos: Inside the CIA Covert Effort to Topple the Syrian Government. That's pretty close to the title. I guess I should know that. But you could just find it online on Amazon. There's like a paperback copy or a Kindle version. And then on Twitter, my handle is just at WVANWAGENEN, like W and then my last name, Van Wagenen. Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It's a great, it was a nice conversation, and so it'd be nice to do it again. Appreciate the invite.
Of course, man. Anytime you want to come on, just hit me up and we'll get you back on. And all right, everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next episode.